Chapter 1260. With Griffin's silent approval, Amandina turned around and finally spoke to Tamar. Mr. Tamar, is this true? Of course, the 2 points I said are absolutely true. However, as for how stable it is in an area that is not affected by the ancient fire seed, further experiments are needed. At the very least, it is much more stable than an ordinary fire seed. Very, very stable. This is an ironclad fact. And after our experiments, this fire seed can produce certain changes in its surroundings even if it is not ignited. It can stabilize the order in an area about 300 meters in diameter. This is very similar to the ancient fire seed and the ring of envelopes. Amandina nodded. This was the reason why the druids and tree elves were able to build tree cities in the dark forest and around the loop of trade winds. She was also very clear about what this meant. If the fire seed could affect the surrounding environment even if it was not ignited, it meant that it could provide great protection to the knight who carried it. One had to know that there were many places in the dark forest that were very unstable. In the early stages of Tonagil's exploration of the dark forest, many casualties came from the rapid changes in the order and laws of the dark forest. Sudden rain of fire, cracks, and landslides were more exaggerated, but waves of monsters, sudden drops in temperature, and unpredictable changes in the composition of the air were more common in the dark forest. This was only the periphery of the dark forest. The deeper they went, the more unpredictable the changes in the Sea of Chaos would be. It was not strange for an entire area to collapse into the void. However, if they used this new fire seed, it would be much safer to explore the dark forest. Correspondingly, the cost of exploration would be greatly reduced. But there was only one problem now, and that was the cost of the fire seed. If this fire seed could be produced in large quantities, then the era of Tonagil changing the world had truly arrived. The southern part of the loop of trade winds was a vast and rich land, and every high-ranking member of the ABs knew that. What does it take to create this fire seed? Amandina asked softly as she took a light breath. Miss Amandina, my research progressed because of the stone tablet that the Lord sent back from the Cruz Empire. Before that, no matter how hard we tried, we were unable to achieve the effects of the ancient fire seed in the loop of trade winds. I found that the slate contained the order and law that the creator of the tinder yearned for. Those are the elements of creation. Although it's only a small part, I've never seen a similar law on anything in this world except for that slate. Tamar paused for a moment. I need that kind of slate. As long as we have that kind of slate, we can continuously produce fire seed. It's not difficult. And didn't Sir Lord say that there's a lot of that kind of slate? Just like everyone who was focused on a certain field, Tamar seemed a little excited at the mention of the birth of this fire seed. He was about to talk non-stop, but Amandina interrupted him. How many of these fire seeds can you produce right now? 10, only 10. But if you give me more time, I might be able to decipher something from the stone slab. By the way, Miss Amandina, where can we find such a slate? He asked impatiently. Amandina did not answer him directly. She looked at Princess Griffin. Mr. Brando said that a slate fell to the south of the Kalanga Mountains. Your Highness, I heard that the Bugas are fighting for this slate. Maybe they keep it a secret and block the news. We have to get that slate back. If all of this is true, then maybe Mr. Brando's vision can really be realized. Erwin's future will not be limited to one place. Amandina obviously agreed with this point. She nodded silently. As one of the earliest followers of Brando, she was certainly aware of the Lord's plan. It could be said that when everyone still had their eyes on Erwin, the latter had already begun to prepare to expand into the Black Forest. Whether it was the expedition to seize the loop of trade winds or the subsequent full support for the development of the Black Forest, it could be said that they were all preparatory work for the present. And now, the opportunity had appeared in front of them. Of course, they would not give up. What's more, even the slate that Tamar mentioned was sent back by Brando. Lord Brando had obviously arranged all of this for a long time. Of course, she had to go step by step. But the current situation with Erwin made her feel a bit of a dilemma. Amandina thought for a moment, frowned and said with some worry. But Your Highness, do we have to divert our energy from the war in the north? Just dealing with Madara alone will require Erwin to do his best. In the end, although Amandina arranged everything carefully and thoroughly, and was calm and decisive, she did not have the foresight of Brando on such matters. On the contrary, the princess was more determined. Separate this matter from the war with Madara and put Maynard in charge. This is an important matter that is no less important than the war with Madara. In fact, I think it is even more important than that war. Amandina frowned. The development of the Black Forest was not a trivial matter. It itself required a considerable amount of resources and energy from Tonajol. The key was manpower. Dealing with the war with Madara had reduced the manpower that ABEs could mobilize by more than half. Although the return of the diplomatic group temporarily solved the urgent problem at hand, Maynard alone was obviously not enough to support the entire development of the Black Forest. They still needed the manpower below, the knight in charge of the development, and the support of the caravan and the person in charge of the caravan. Not to mention the disappearance of the Roman lady, Medisha, and Hippamra, the manpower was really a bit lacking. Princess Griffin seemed to see the worry in her heart and smiled slightly. Amandina, you know that this is also Mr. Brando's expectation because he sees it more clearly than we do. This will be Erwin's tomorrow. We can't ignore the future because of the present, especially when he has done everything for us. We are just helping him make a decision, and we have to take responsibility for this. I understand, Your Highness, but there will always be a way, Griffin replied. She turned to Tamar and said, Mr. Tamar, I'll have to trouble you to continue this work. Tonajol will fully support you, and as long as you want, you will be able to get it. Even though Tamar appeared to be a little emotional, he quickly understood the crux of the matter and bowed slightly to the princess. If it's just the first batch, we may be able to take a shortcut. I will find a way to organize the apprentices to produce a batch of these fire seeds, about 3 to 5 of them, but the failure rate may be a little high, Your Highness. Griffin nodded, then looked at Amandina and asked, will the transfer of manpower from the Alchemy Association affect the first test of the Arcanite device? The Alchemy Association was a newly established organization in Valhalla. Ever since the 5th stage of the Stronghold's development, the Shire's Moon Tower and Tamar's Alchemy Association had been separated from each other. This year, Amandina had followed Brando's lead and recruited many outstanding alchemists, mainly those with potential, greatly enriching the organization. Of course, Amandina replied, but it's fine, I will borrow some people from the Shire, and I can arrange it myself. The problem now is that because of the war in the north, we have transferred everyone away, and the development of the Dark Forest was suspended 2 months ago. We can't find anyone for the time being. Perhaps there is someone else, Griffin thought for a moment and replied, let's see if Mr. Reto can help us. It's difficult, Valhalla can't leave the veterans to maintain order, and Lord Coden won't let them go either. That old man has been complaining to me every day that he doesn't have enough manpower, Your Highness. Even if it's you, he would be furious if you took people from him. Amandina replied, if we want to form an expedition to the south in a short time to search for the slate, there might be some people we can use. Who? Your Highness, do you know how Lord Brendel gained a foothold in ABs? Are you talking about the adventurers? Lady Yuta is inextricably linked to them, and she just returned from cruise. If she is willing to help us, but the front lines need her, and the new recruits of the White Lion Guards also need someone to train them. Let me go. Just as the 3 of them were frowning in thought, a voice came from outside the hole. Amandina heard the voice and turned around in surprise. Miss Scarlet. Albert, gather the members of the Grey Wolves mercenaries. I want to see everyone, and I have something to announce. Boss, what's wrong? Did something happen? Or is the war going to mobilize us? In the middle of Valhalla, a young man walked to the stairs of the Grey Wolves Inn and asked in the direction of the voice from the second floor. His voice was so loud and clear that it attracted the attention of almost everyone in the hall. Neither. I want to rebuild the Grey Wolves mercenaries. Really? When the young man heard this, he almost jumped up. His eyes were almost shining. Big sister, are you serious? I didn't hear wrongly, right? Have you thought it through? What are you waiting for? I understand. Leave it to me. I promise that everyone will be here in 15 minutes. If anyone doesn't come, I'll teach them a lesson. The young man almost jumped up and rushed out of the hall without looking back. Chapter 1261. The Grey Wolves Mercenaries. Is that the mercenary group that Miss Scarlet used to be in? Dilferi, the daughter of Count Yenbao, asked as she sat on a high-backed chair. She closed the book in her hands and looked at the girl in front of her with eyes as gentle as water. Scarlet nodded. She arched her back and bit down on her lower lip with her sharp canine teeth. She reached to her waist and tried to pull on the belt of her knight's uniform. Her pale fingers fiddled with it twice but to no avail. Dilferi, help me with this. Dilferi reached out and took the belt and handed it to Scarlet. Thank you. Scarlet let out a sigh of relief. She twirled her fingers around the belt and skillfully tied a knot. Then she picked up the soft leather armor on the desk and put it over her head. Her hands reached behind her slender neck and pulled up her long crimson hair. It spread out like a flowing waterfall. She used one hand to tug at her long hair and the other to wrap the blue ribbon around it a few times. She tied the knot and tied it into a long ponytail. Ovino leaned against the door frame with her arms crossed. She watched calmly as Scarlet got ready. Will you be gone for a long time? Dilferi looked up at Scarlet's back and asked. Yes. What if the Count comes back in the meantime? The curve of the girl's back stiffened slightly. She shook her head gently and picked up the breastplate from the ground. She crossed the two leather straps over her back and wrapped them around her strong waist. She tightened the straps and fastened them together with a metal lock. Next was the breastplate. She turned around and looked at the girl curled up in the chair. Dilferi was wearing a black chiffon dress. Her skin was pale without a trace of blood. The muscles in her legs had shrunk a little, making them frighteningly slender. Her arms were similarly slender, and her waist was so slender that it could be held with one hand. She was holding a large book in both hands, and her entire body was leaning against the velvet cushion of the chair. Her face seemed to have become thinner, and the forbidden spell was burning away at her remaining life force like gangrene. However, as if it was some kind of compensation from the unseen world, the light in the girl's eyes became brighter, like the reflection of countless stars in a deep lake. The stars burned one by one, as if all her energy was about to emerge from within. Scarlet hesitated for a moment before extending her back plate and looking at her questioningly. Dilferi took it without hesitation. She took a deep breath. It was a little heavy. Scarlet turned around. Dilferi propped herself up and pressed the deck against the curve of Scarlet's back. Scarlet raised her right hand while her left hand held onto the straps on her back. She buckled them onto one side of the breastplate, then the other. The Black Forest is dangerous. It's all right. There's no danger in the Black Forest near AB's territory unless it's after midnight. This is all thanks to the Count. Yes. Scarlet was a little silent. Before the Count left, he asked Princess Chiara for a favor on my behalf. After returning to Cypher, she kept her promise. Now, His Highness Levin Renessen's special envoy has arrived in Yenbao, accompanied by the frigates Sheffield, Dark Wind, and Vesa. A few days ago, Princess Griffin gave me a letter saying that although my father was under house arrest by my brothers, he was fine. Dilferi propped up her back plate and rambled on, her tone a little soft. Congratulations, Dilfary. Scarlet was genuinely happy for Dilfary. But this is already the second favor I owe the Count. He won't mind, Scarlet replied. But Yenbao can't think that way, otherwise it would be ungrateful. I represent the glory of the family, and I have an obligation to sacrifice for the family. But you've sacrificed enough. Dilfary felt the grip on her hand loosen. Scarlet had already secured her back plate armor. She picked up the azure lance that was propped up on the desk beside her. A few bandages were wrapped around the lance to prevent the sweat from slipping off her hands. She then turned around to look at Scarlet. I'm leaving, Dilfary. Dilfary was startled. Are you going deep into the Black Forest? Yes, it's a little further than usual. That will be doubly dangerous. Scarlet shook her head. With the fire seed invented by Mr. Tamar, exploring the Black Forest is now very safe. You don't have to lie to me. This expedition is experimental in nature, isn't it? Because Amandina did not suppress the news of the birth of the new fire seed, the latter spread at an unimaginable speed. In a short time, the entire AB's territory knew about it. It could be predicted that when the news spread to Ampere Seal and even further north, it would have a huge impact on the world of order. However, in contrast to the rapid spread of the news, the progress of the experiment was very slow. In the past week, the new fire seed had only been tested a few times near the Black Forest. Amandina had sent out a few troglodyte expeditions, but the results were satisfactory. The mission of the Grey Wolves mercenaries was not only to go deep into the Black Forest and find the war slate that fell in the south of the Loop of Trade Winds, but more importantly, to obtain first-hand data of the new fire seed in the depths of the Black Forest. This was a crucial part of Tonagel's plan. Of course, this was quite risky. Amandina had privately contacted Scarlet several times, hoping that the latter would not go personally, at least not for the first time, but she was rejected one by one. Scarlet's rare assertiveness and stubbornness seemed to remind people that she was one of the few captains in the Grey Wolves mercenaries. Dilfary's words reminded her of something. She thought that Dilfary was also a lobbyist sent by Amandina. Scarlet frowned slightly and was about to speak. But what Count Yenbao's daughter said next gave her a huge shock. Take me with you, Miss Scarlet. Ha! Can I go with you? Miss Dilfary, I haven't seen the Black Forest yet. Did I tell you? Yenbao is not at the border of civilization. I've always wanted to see the world outside of order. But that won't do, your body. I won't be a burden to you. Dilfary smiled playfully at Scarlet. She reached out her pale and slender hand and patted the arm of the chair. The four legs of the chair immediately jumped up and walked around the former. The Highlander girl was so shocked that she could not close her mouth. She stared at the lively chair with wide eyes. A living chair. I made it myself. What do you think? This. But. No, Scarlet shook her head vigorously. No, I can't take you on this risk. Dilfary looked at her pitifully and blinked her long eyelashes. About Yenbao, Princess Kiara will take care of it. Why do you have to do this? Didn't I say that Yenbao owes the Count 2 favors? I can only consider returning one. I will help you. I can summon demons. Summon demons? Scarlet was shocked. Demonic magic was taboo in the mortal world. On the other hand, Brando did keep Count Yenbao's daughter's mouth a secret. Well, you should know that demonic magic is very useful in the world outside of order. Dilfary reached out an arm. A little demon with fleshy wings climbed up from behind the chair and jumped onto her shoulder. It then followed her slender arm all the way to her palm. Count Yenbao's daughter held the little thing up and put her other hand to her mouth. She bent down and coughed heavily twice. Then she looked up and said to Scarlet, "This is a little demon. Its scientific name is imp. Its real name is #4072NA78S. It can sense the existence of magic flow. Magic is one of the main components of the world, especially outside of order. In the area where magic flow is chaotic, it is easy to find monsters' nests. If you have the little demon's help, I can help you avoid those large nests. But, I also need the spring of youth, don't I? It only exists in the depths of the Black Forest. I am also exploring for my own sake. But the master said that he would help you. Then I owe him 3 favors. I don't even know how to pay him back. Plus, my status doesn't allow me to marry him. Besides, Miss Scarlet wouldn't be willing to do that, right? Scarlet felt her face burn. She felt that Dilfery must have said that on purpose. Count Yinbao's daughter's bright eyes were full of cunning. Even if you say that. Damn it, I agree. I shouldn't have dealt with you sly city folk in the first place. It was Amandina who asked you to come, wasn't it? Miss Scarlet isn't stupid at all. Dilfery smiled a little weakly. The Highlander girl stomped her feet angrily, turned around and walked out of the room. Ovina, who was leaning against the door, shrugged. She calmly followed Dilfery down the stairs. Alaws, forward. Don't stop. Watch your left flank. The dragons spread out like swallows in a storm, crisscrossing each other and advancing in different directions. Streaks of golden light moved forward in the pitch-black storm. Countless crystals fell from the sky like raindrops, landing heavily on the ground and shattering into pieces. Every time this happened, the crew's army on the ground would erupt into cheers. Duke Leftorina stood behind the rows of Imperial Knights, watching the scene through the forest of metal spears. The biting cold wind blew past his temples, gently ruffling the gray beard on his cheeks. This was already the second time the dragons had passed over the Meklo River. When they spread their wings and swooped down, the flames they spat out were like golden-red lava waterfalls falling from the sky, plowing out a few charred intervals in the tide like crystal clusters. They forcefully stopped the monster's attack. Chapter 1262. A few white dragons flew in an O shape in the air, signaling to the Imperial army below, telling the humans which direction they would attack from next, so that the Imperial Knight could cooperate with them to disperse the attacks of the crystal clusters. Seeing this scene, the representative of the northern military aristocracy, who was now more than 110 years old and had experienced the last holy war, could not help but feel his blood boiling. 1,000 years ago, in the War of the Holy Saints, the mortals, the dragons, the silver folk, the elves, the humans, and the dwarves also fought side by side so intimately. What a magnificent epic that was, because under the constraint of the sacred covenant, the races of the continent fought together against the darkness. Attack! He raised the sword in his hand and pointed straight ahead. 12 dukes, counts of the empire, knight, listen to my command, my brothers, young men. For victory, for the empire, attack. Kill. The knights marched forward in rows, making noises that sounded like a tsunami. On the front line of human beings, they were like a silver belt of light that crossed the scorched land and collided with the tide-like crystal clusters. Then the second, the third, released the arrows. The longbowmen of the Empire began to take deep breaths, calibrating their posture, and then released their hands. There was a sharp sound, like a scythe sweeping across the entire battlefield. Armor-piercing steel arrows with conical arrowheads rose into the sky like locusts, then burst into circles of bright magic arrays, and the arrows passed through these magic arrays one by one. Sharp, enemy suppression, flame explosion, acceleration, and stability, the silver light was added layer by layer on the arrow shaft, arrow feather, and arrow through the magic arrays, falling like a rainstorm. It was a rain of light, the raindrops fell in a disorderly manner, and the monsters at the forefront fell one by one. The Empire had been at war with the Hazel people for many years, facing the latest generation of Hazel magic constructs, the Heavy Night Hunter Trial, and the Pusher Fortress. Naturally, they were not inferior to the smugglers on the Rosaline border who were not at a disadvantage. The dragon spear used by the smugglers was a product of the Hazer people about 5 years ago. Now, it was almost obsolete for civilian use. As for the military constructs, the Hazer Empire had always regarded them as a prohibited secret. In front of the truly powerful human empires and in front of the smugglers, the Crystal Cluster, who flaunted its prowess in front of the smugglers, clearly did not have much of an advantage. The casualty ratio between the two sides was constant at a certain ratio, but the heavy pressure came from the dark storm. Countless crystal clusters were emerging as if there was no end to them. Almost all the crew's commanders on the battlefield looked in that direction with a grave expression. The feelings in his heart were complicated and hard to understand. Less than half a month ago, that place was still known as Bank City, the capital of the Empire. It represented the will of the Silver Queen and commanded the army that obeyed her orders to sweep towards East Metz. Since the fall of the Black Moon, Her Majesty's army had collapsed, but the enemy still came from that direction. It was just that this time, it was more ferocious and suffocating. In the dark storm, there seemed to be a frenzied will that wanted to destroy the entire human world. On the night when dusk fell, the front line in East Metz was almost instantly hit hard. After the Central Legion of the Empire suffered a near-destructive blow, almost the entire establishment disappeared. The heavy losses caused the Black Legion, who was guarding the Ludwig area directly opposite, to sort out the exact news of the front line only after 2 days. Almost the entire Bank City had completely fallen. The traffic in the direction of the Sublime Inland Sea was also completely cut off. They had lost contact with the Cloak Bay. The White Legion had lost more than half of its members, and there was still no news of the Azure Legion. The Hazer people, who were also neighbors of the Bank City, had lost many of their men. But at this time, the Dukes of the Empire no longer cared about the situation of their original enemies. Because the Crystal Cluster army had begun to advance towards the Metz area again. Endless monsters poured out from the storm. If it were not for the timely arrival of the dragons, the crew's people might have directly retreated to the front line of Fat Tamport. But even so, the situation was still not optimistic. If it was the Empire under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in its heyday, they might be able to contend with the Crystal Cluster army. But now, the crew's people had lost 2/3 of their empire. On the other side of the Evergreen Corridor, due to the heavy impact of the Black Moon's fall on Anzaruta and the Rokizi Highlands, a fault zone of thousands of kilometers long formed there, completely destroying the Empire's local grassroots organization. Now, from Vargas to Lone, it was a mess. Only Anzaruta on the border was not affected. The nobles there were trying to get in touch with the wilderness of the Four Territories, but so far, they had not been able to get in touch with the Metz area and the Red Legion. The Evergreen Corridor was cut in two. Although Vala, the old Chancellor Nydivan, and Veronica, who had just arrived in Mihodafen, had already gotten in touch with Fat Tamport, the envoys sent to Saint Tossol and Fanzan for help had yet to bring back any news. It was as if the whole world had fallen into a fragmented silence. For the people of the Empire, who were under the attack of Twilight, this kind of depression was especially heavy. Needless to say, the crystal clusters were getting stronger every day. The rising tides from the Sea of Magic were like endless nutrients supporting them to devour the whole world. The attack of the Empire's Knight had some effect. But it was very limited. After 2 attacks, the Empire's heavy spear-wielding infantrymen regained their footing and pushed the battle line back to the south bank of the Maklo River. Silver flashes flashed in the sky, and then silver meteors fell through the clouds. The crystal clusters far and near immediately swelled up and exploded into dazzling explosions. Countless crystal cluster limbs were lifted into the sky and then fell, covering the entire wilderness. Levto picked up his pocket watch. The needle had moved 15 grids, and he sighed. The time that the magicians could hold on was getting shorter and shorter. The reason was that Her Majesty the Queen had divided the Holy Cathedral of Fire and taken away too many bishops and priests, which was a heavy blow to the Empire's magicians. There were not many people who escaped from the Banqual area, and even fewer priests. If it were not for Vala gathering the local forces after the appearance of these monsters, there would be even fewer magicians in the hands of the military nobles. But even now, they could not hold on much longer. He silently calculated the time and was about to send in the next wave of night, but it was at this time that the sky suddenly flashed 1,000 times brighter. This, Duke Lefto Reina jerked his head back. A dazzling rain of light slowly fell from the sky. They were like countless lines descending from the sky and connecting to the horizon. Then, a terrifying explosion occurred in the front line of the crystal clusters. In an instant, the explosion almost covered the entire battlefield. The shock wave swept across, and even the human heavy infantry at the front row were overturned. After the rain of light, the thick clouds in the sky immediately closed again, as if everything that happened just a moment ago was just an illusion. However, the old Duke looked at the front line that had been blasted to the ground. For the first time in days, the crystal cluster offensive had paused for a moment. The scorched earth and the confused Imperial infantrymen who were crawling up from the ground reminded him of the reality of what had just happened. A strategic spell. A low-level commander's exclamation came from afar. Is it the Red Army's magician group supporting us? Have they contacted the wilderness of 4 territories? Everyone turned to look at him. But Duke Lefto Reina was silent for a moment, and shook his head firmly. His grey-blue eyes flashed like flames. It's the Buga. The silver folk are here. Alaz flew over the human front line, leaving a huge shadow on the ground. This was the 3rd time she had bypassed the Meklo River. The little female dragon's huge golden pupils reflected the scorched ground, and the human knight and archers were cheering. In the past, she would have sneered at these ants, but at this time, her heart was full of soft feelings. How similar this scene was. Just like the war 1,000 years ago. Those annoying mortals, at times like this, often showed admirable courage. They were fighting for their homeland, fighting side by side with her. Every time this happened, a small figure would appear in her heart. Humph, she snorted softly, and thought, stupid human, stupid Brando. Alaz, continue to the left, pay attention to the left wing, cover the human heavy knight's flank. The majestic voice descended from the clouds, and the rebellious little female dragon did not dare to have the slightest objection in the face of this voice, because it was the pride of the dragons, closest to the will of the dragon god. That was an order from Gwyneth herself. She somersaulted in mid-air, and immediately flew south along the tangential line of the Meklo River, with Flora and the other 3 black dragons following closely behind her. This was already the 2nd time she had cut diagonally in the direction of Keswaru. The battlefield of the dragons was far larger than what humans saw on the ground. Every time they cut along the entire battlefield, their flight path was distributed over the battlefield with a diameter of hundreds of kilometers. She knew that this time she had to cut close to Rushta, where the dragons had already blocked the flying crystal clusters once. Looks like there's something new in that hole. The little female dragon thought silently. P.S. I thought I could write back to Brando and Madara today, but the progress is still a bit slow. Continue to ask for votes next month. Chapter 1263. Every time Alaz flapped her wings, the pectoralis major that connected the contours of both wings vibrated powerfully, stretching the long tendons and wing membranes to generate airflow. Then the pectoralis minor that rose from the keel abruptly contracted, pulling the wing's surface upward to generate lift. The muscles covered in golden dragon scales moved like snakes. Every time they contracted and expanded, they provided thousands of pounds of force. The 4 dragons passed through the center of the storm like 4 straight lines. She swung her huge head in the turbid storm, her long horns shaped like sharp blades cutting through the dark clouds. A golden flame wool in her eye sockets was like a radar wave, accurately sweeping across the uneven ground, leaving nothing hidden in the chaos to hide. Rushta had disappeared. This once bustling area with millions of people was now a huge pit in Allah's size. This pit started from the Kurik area in the east, to the middle of the Cloak Hills in the south, to the Hazel Mountains in the west, and to the south of the Ludwig Mountains in the north. Other than the chaotic creatures that staggered and crawled in the pit, not a single blade of grass grew. Allah's gaze swept across the forest that was scorched at the edge of the disaster. Tens of thousands of acres of woodland were reduced to ashes in an instant, and now only the bare and charred tree trunks stood on the barren land, shrouded in the dense black storm. The charred bodies of animals could be seen everywhere in the forest. Because the tiny creatures on them were extinct, the carcasses had not been decomposed yet. Occasionally, purple lightning flashed across the sky, reminding them that time was still passing in this world. But other than that, this was a truly dead world. There were no signs of life, except for those annoying crystal lifeforms in the sky and on the ground. A gargoyle-like crystal cluster suddenly rushed out of the storm in front of them. It let out a sharp cry, as if the crystals were resonating, then flapped its two pairs of wings and pounced in this direction, its upper and lower jaws made of crystals biting hard on Allah's upper arm bone. But it was futile. As a golden dragon, Allah's could not care less about such a weak attack. She crashed into it directly, her wing bones smashing into the monster's upper and lower jaw, smashing its head into pieces. The crystal cluster that had lost its breath of life quickly spun and fell to the ground. But strange cries rang out, and dozens of such monsters were rushing out of the storm, pouncing in this direction. Maintain the formation. Allah's ordered in a seemingly dignified manner, although her voice was somewhat childish. They were nothing but cannon fodder. No one knew what they were protecting in the central area, but the power of the giant dragon was far beyond that of the low-level crystal clusters. An asymmetrical battle was taking place in the sky. The dragons did not even need to expend any energy to pass through the monsters. Their fangs and claws tore through the defense of the crystal clusters, and the monsters fell like dumplings into a pot. One of the dragons that loved to show off even breathed out a mouthful of fire. The golden-red dragon breath lit up the sky like lava, and the crystal monsters immediately turned white under the high temperature and exploded like glass shards. I'm getting closer and closer to that thing, leaving the scattered crystal clusters far behind. Allah's gaze swept across the dark clouds in front of her. This was the second time she had investigated this direction, and it was closer than the last time. There seemed to be something in the clouds that interfered with her magic vision. She knew that there was another group of giant dragons within 100 miles, but she had lost track of them. Earlier in the morning, the white dragons of Alate lost 2 of their companions here. Every giant dragon was a precious fighting force, and Lord Owenlos had sent air forces in this direction 3 times in an attempt to find their missing kin. But Allah's had a faint feeling that they were doomed. She wondered what the crystal clusters could do to affect the giant dragons. The spatial rift in the direction of Lushta was not enough to send mid-level crystal clusters and above into wound. In this battle, the threat of these monsters to the giant dragons was not as great as the harsh weather. Flora, let's try to get closer. I keep feeling that there's something in the clouds. The silver dragon behind Allah's immediately rose in altitude and answered this sentence with action. The 2 black dragon Lolas behind them were still underage, so they naturally had no objections. The 4 giant dragons began to circle closer to the cloud in the center of the giant crater. In the center of the storm did not stop at all. The black clouds formed a huge vortex here, and the spiral arm swept across a range of hundreds of miles every few minutes. Humans could not stand in such a turbulence, but it did not have much effect on the giant dragons. In front, Flora suddenly took the initiative to speak, which was rare. Allah's immediately tensed up. The silver dragon was the best at magic among the giant dragons, and she knew that Flora must have noticed something. A moment later, circles of ripples appeared in her magic vision. The center of the ripples was in the southwest of the cloud, and was a few 100 feet higher than them. The moment they discovered the other party immediately turned to their 11 clock and dived in a tangential manner towards their predetermined path. Obviously, the other party had also discovered them. This is not a crystal cluster, they're faster, be careful. Alaz reminded. She suddenly turned around and crossed paths with Flora. A few dark creatures came out of the storm above her head, leaving a few trails of black smoke, and disappeared into the clouds below the dragons. However, the smoke could not block the dragon's magic vision. Alaz clearly saw that those things circled below the clouds and chased from behind. Flora, split up. The little female dragon used a magical message to remind her mate. The mates of dragons were often the closest partners, and the silver dragon girl immediately understood what her mate meant. She swayed her tail to change her balance, and turned her body sideways to distance herself from Alaz. The two dragons immediately separated, one on the left and one on the right. Alaz took the opportunity to take a look behind her. The dark creatures, with the help of the potential energy conversion, circled around her and chased after her. She saw that it was a few beetles that opened their shells and flapped their wings quickly to chase after her. Horseshoe beetles. Alaz immediately found the names and habits of these creatures from the inheritance of the dragon clan. She could not help but change her expression slightly. Horseshoe beetles were a rare species of dusk, and they had actually revived. She plunged into the clouds below, lowering her altitude to provide an opportunity for her mate. The beetles immediately caught up, but Alaz sensed the distance between Flora and her while leading the few idiots forward. After the two dragons separated, they circled around each other, drawing two arcs that rapidly closed in on each other. The two arcs crossed each other at a certain point in time. The silver dragon's wings were like a sharp blade as it swept past Alaz's back and flew between the beetles, tearing them apart. Then they exchanged positions with each other and did it again. Go help them. After cleaning up the tail, Alaz immediately turned back and flew in the direction of the two little black dragons. She was worried about the two underage little ones. Although she had just passed her coming-of-age ceremony, as a generation that had experienced the War of the Holy Saints, her combat experience was much more outstanding than those little ones born in peacetime. But immediately there was a shrill scream from behind the clouds. Alaz's expression changed. She and Flora went around the cloud wall just in time to see one of the black dragons falling to the ground under the siege of the beetles. Her mate let out a shrill scream. He did not even care about the battle and anxiously swooped down in that direction. Don't go, come back, she's hopeless. Alaz was so anxious that her eyes were about to spit fire. But it was at this moment that she saw a scene that she would never forget. In the middle of the cloud cluster in the middle of the battlefield, the clouds suddenly separated, revealing a pitch-black object. It was a perfectly round sphere, like a black hole hanging in the middle of the battlefield. Countless dense purple lightning was climbing up this black sphere. Yes, it was going up, like a reverse waterfall. And the moment the black sphere appeared, a black beam of light penetrated the body of the black dragon lowly. The latter opened her mouth and fell to the ground. Mary! Flora, run separately. Alaz's heart throbbed, and a deep sense of crisis welled up in the depths of her heart. She saw in her golden eyes that after the clouds dispersed, countless dense black dots were flying in the direction of the East Met's battlefront. Those were the crystal clusters and beetles. The number was more than 10 times the total number of the crystal cluster army she had seen in the past 3 days. But it was too late to escape. The center of the black hole suddenly emerged with a terrible suction force, not allowing her and Flora to resist, and pulled them in that direction. No matter how hard Alaz struggled, it could not change the fact that they were getting closer and closer to that thing. The little female dragon gritted her teeth and called out the name of Lord Ovanlos over and over again in her heart, hoping that the godly dragon could help her at this time. After all, the two groups of dragons were sent here by the latter to investigate. But she soon found in despair that all her magic communication was blocked by the strange interference in the clouds. At that moment, she suddenly understood how the two white dragons disappeared. The answer was here. It's over, we're dead this time. This thought suddenly flashed through Allah's mind. Chapter 1264. The dragons were not afraid of death. The golden folk regarded death as a new life, the beginning of another life. Just like in myths and legends, death and rebirth were often twin divine powers, and they were also under the jurisdiction of the same goddess. At the last moment of her life, Olaz raised her head and looked longingly at Ferofa in front of her. She thought to herself, at least I can die in front of Ferofa. But it was at this moment that the little female dragon suddenly saw in horror that her mate, the silver dragon girl who had always been silent, suddenly turned her head and looked at her with her silver eyes that were filled with incomparable attachment. In the depths of that pair of pupils, the panic in Allah's heart was reflected. No! In her horrified voice, Ferofa suddenly turned around and slammed into her, knocking her out of the gravitational line of the black hole. At that moment, Olaz only felt that the world was spinning, but in her vision, she stared fixedly at the silver line that streaked across the darkness and accelerated towards the center of the black hole. Ferofa. In the darkness, the sound of the sea crashing against the cabin seemed to be very rhythmic, as if there was a rhythm from ancient times, long and slow, which could induce sleep. Brando did not know how many times his consciousness woke up from the chaos and fell asleep again in this slow rhythm. After repeating this several times, he could finally hear the surrounding environment clearly. He felt a somewhat cold hand touching his forehead. It was somewhat soft, like a Roman hand. After a moment, it left, making him feel a little lost. Then there was the sound of water, and a wet handkerchief was placed on his forehead. It was cool, making him feel a little more awake. The sound of conversation came from the darkness. What's wrong with the teacher, Miss Delphian? He first heard a voice, young but very calm, and felt that it was somewhat familiar. But his mind was in a mess, and his thoughts were in a mess. When he sank down to recall, countless memory fragments were washed up like a tide on the beach, making it impossible for him to carry out any detailed thinking. I don't know, maybe it's because of the wine, as Mr. Liu said, but thank you, Lady Martha. Brando finally survived the most dangerous period. He still has a fever now, but it's not a big deal. The second voice was quiet and elegant, and also familiar to him, as if it was a person he had known for a long time, but he felt a little awkward. Brando's mind was a little muddled. Who is Delphian? Is it someone I know? Seems like it, but I can't remember. Hiss. As usual, a stab of pain interrupted his thoughts. Then I'll have to trouble you, Miss Delphian. A man's voice. This is what I should do. Mr. Brendel is my friend, Mr. Liu. Then we'll go up. Well, he still needs to rest, maybe he'll wake up soon. If anything happens outside, you can let me know. I want to stay here too. A harsh, male voice said indignantly. Mr. Fong Chi, the teacher needs to rest, didn't you hear Miss Delphian's words? My dear cousin, when adults are talking, children shouldn't interrupt. Please conduct yourself with dignity. Delphian said coldly. Then I can't let you stay in the same room with this guy alone. Miss Delphian, after we succeed, I hope you can become my empress. The 9 Phoenix will never be handed over to someone like you. The somewhat childish voice replied angrily. That's not necessarily true, my dear cousin, your Jade Phoenix clan doesn't seem to be any better. Humph, then there was the sound of footsteps going up the stairs. Mr. Liu sighed and chased after her. Mr. Fong Chi, if you still want to cooperate with me, please respect my will. Delphian's cold voice sounded. I don't quite understand, Miss Delphian, you clearly hate him so much, why are you doing this? Is it because of those guys on the ship? I think you don't have to care about those people. Since Mr. Fong Chi is so confident, why are you still here? That's because. The man's voice was a little awkward. There are no other ships on the sea, right? That's because someone bragged about himself, but he couldn't even protect his own fleet, Delphine replied coldly. If you don't want to get into trouble with Mr. Blank, I suggest you leave at once. Otherwise, I'll have to ask Mr. Marshall to uphold justice. Damn it. The man's voice was a little angry, but after a moment of silence, he relaxed a lot. Okay, as you wish. Then he went upstairs. After a while, Brando heard the sound of the door closing with a splitting headache. Then there was a series of soft footsteps that went all the way to the bedside. He felt someone sit down beside him, and he could even feel the other person's gaze on him. The room was silent, and only the sound of the waves outside could be heard. The cabin was shaking. He already knew that he was on a ship, but he couldn't remember anything else. After a long time, he heard a faint sigh. Then, he felt a soft and boneless hand caressing his chest. It moved slowly and finally stopped at the left side of his chest. The hand stopped there, as if silently feeling the powerful beat of his heart. Mr. Brando, I've never been so close to revenge. Listen to the sound of your heart beating, so strong, and I'm only a few centimeters away from it. The woman's voice was a little pleasant. Brando's mind suddenly tightened, as if by instinct, he felt danger, and even his muscles tensed up. But Delphine didn't notice. But I can't do that. The Prime Minister's daughter bit her lower lip so hard that her pearly white teeth sunk deep into her lips, almost drawing blood. How laughable. Elman once asked me, why did I fall in love with him? I've always known in my heart that I fell in love with him for the benefit of the Nidvin family. Elman also understood this, but he never blamed me. Yes, I'm a cold-blooded woman, I don't know what love is, and I don't deserve to be loved. But what's wrong with that? I grew up with the grace of my family, the education I received, the good living conditions I had, everything came from my grandfather, my father. What right do people like us have to talk about love? What right do they have? What right does Elman have? We all know this very well. But what about those socialites in the capital? They're nothing compared to me. Love, haha. Brendel felt the woman using her fingernails to draw on his chest, and his mind gradually came back to him. He felt the fine sensation of her fingernails moving along his chest, and every time it made him shudder. This crazy woman, he felt his headache begin to subside, and his memories gradually became clearer. But suddenly, he felt Delphine close to him. She leaned down, and her upper body was on his chest. Her soft breasts pressed against his skin, and the girl's body was burning hot. He almost jumped out of bed in shock. But unfortunately, he couldn't do it, he couldn't even move his pinky. But in the next moment, he calmed down. Because he felt Delphine softly sob, and she lay on his body, sobbing. The cold temperature melted in his chest, and it was tears. I hate you, Mr. Brando. I hate you so much, whether it's the tree herders, or the Queen, because you destroyed everything I had, my plan, my love for Elman, you trampled on my pride, and you didn't even realize it. I can't tolerate, that's so high and mighty. So I want to take revenge on you. Yes, it's not because of Elman, but because I can't tolerate being a failure. When I was imprisoned in Abes, I cursed you day after day, thinking about how to take revenge on you. I wanted revenge, and from then on, I made a plan. Haha, you even saved my life, but because of that, you killed your fiancé. You don't know how happy I was at that moment, Mr. Brando. This sentence was like a spark that fell into a barrel of gunpowder. Brando felt as if there was a fire burning in his heart, and his memories became incomparably clear at that moment. The Roman, the Cat and Whisker Inn, and everything that happened in Rushta were clearly reflected in his heart. The trip to the elemental frontier, the scenes were vivid in his mind, and the farewell with Romaine. At that moment, anger and regret burned his mind, and he raged and woke up. "You deserve to die." Brando let out an extremely angry roar, as if he suddenly regained control of his body, and suddenly jumped up from the bed like a wild beast. Delphine, who was lying on top of him, couldn't react at all, and a hand grabbed her by the throat. With a loud bang, she felt her back hit the cabin. The Prime Minister's daughter let out a muffled groan, then opened her eyes and looked at Brando with some fear. Her face quickly lost its color, and a mixture of shock and confusion appeared on her face. "Brando! Don't! Don't!" She trembled, as if her whole body was paralyzed with fear. But soon, breathing difficulties came, and Delphine opened her mouth like a fish out of water. She opened and closed her mouth to breathe, but she couldn't feel the slightest bit of air. Delphine's eyes were filled with fear, but there was a deep longing for life in the depths of her eyes. She looked at Brando pleadingly, and kept shaking her head, as if she just wanted to live. She reached out to grab Brando's hand, and forcefully pried it open, slapped it, and used her feet to kick Brando's knee, but it was useless. Tears flowed down her face, and she let out a pleading sound, but this sound quickly became soft. Brando coldly looked at this vicious woman, but there was no sympathy in his heart. Chapter 1265. Not dead. Delphine clasped Brando's wrist with both hands. Her fingertips curled as if she was trying to pry his hand away from her snow-white neck. Her chest expanded, and an almost inaudible gasp came from her throat. Her dark purple eyes, which were different from the people of the Empire, quickly became unfocused. Her pupils dilated, and a rainbow-like color appeared in her eyes. The light gradually dimmed. She used the last of her strength to slap her steel-like arm, and the veins on the back of her almost transparent hand bulged ferociously. The will of darkness dominated Brando's mind and thoughts. His eyes reflected the cold light of the magic crystal in the room, and the pale and distorted face of the Prime Minister's daughter was reflected in it. She opened her mouth wide, revealing her snow-white teeth, pink tongue, throat, and tonsils. The lack of oxygen made her mouth open and close like a fish on a chopping board. Brando's twisted heart was somewhat satisfied with this scene. This vicious woman deserved to meet Lady Martha in her ugliest state. This was a trial and a punishment, not only for the Roman, but also for the thousands of people who died in the disaster. But when he thought of the word trial, Brando's heart cleared. The arrogant face of the Silver Queen appeared in front of him. Although the illusion disappeared in an instant, it still made him break out in a cold sweat. His anger subsided a little. He suddenly realized that his actions were no different from those he despised. If he let his anger run wild and killed this woman, then what difference was there between his actions and those of a wild beast? Thinking of this, Brando's tense muscles relaxed a little. The Prime Minister's daughter seemed to have found a trace of salvation in the endless abyss. She breathed desperately, as if she wanted to squeeze the last bit of air into her lungs. She let out a whimper, and Brando soon felt cold tears falling on the back of his hand. When you cry, you don't think that the people you hurt are also crying because of you. Delphine shook her head weakly. In the darkness, the girl's pale face was full of weakness and pity. Brando looked at the woman, unsure whether she was too afraid or just pretending. He deeply understood that this woman was carefully dressed up for a disguise and a lie. This knowledge made him a little cold-hearted, and he turned a blind eye to this scene. The Roman. She's not dead. The Prime Minister's daughter stared blankly ahead. The lack of oxygen had nearly blinded her. Her hair was dripping wet and drooping on her forehead. She was sweating profusely, completely soaking her clothes and sticking her back to the damp cabin. But when she opened her mouth, she held her center of gravity, and almost gritted her teeth to squeeze out the last word. Brando was shocked. And he subconsciously let his hand, and Delphi fell to the floor like a pile of mud. How did you know? The Prime Minister's daughter lowered her head and painfully covered her neck. There was a circle of purple bruises on her snow-white, slender neck, but she did not dare to waste time. Her voice was a little hoarse as she answered. She is Dusk, but Brando did not care about her pain at all. He directly grabbed her collar and lifted her up from the floor. Who told you all this? He did not believe that Delphian had found the answer by herself. Her knowledge and strength were not qualified to do this, unless she was also a transmigrator. But this Prime Minister's daughter was obviously not. You saw. Brando grabbed the woman's collar and pressed her against the cabin wall with his arm. He said in a low voice, Do you think I will believe you, Miss Delphian? There is a limit to people's trust. We once gave you a chance, but you didn't cherish it. I saw it with my own eyes. I also know your secret. Delphian lowered her head in despair, and her mouth opened and closed as she answered. Her voice was so weak that it was almost inaudible. But Brando still heard it. He was horrified and shocked. What secret? Delphine raised her head and tried her best to lean into his ear. She panted slightly and said softly, Don't worry. The amber sword. Brendel furrowed his brows when he felt her breath on his earlobe, but he sighed in relief. At least it isn't that secret. But Delphian's words still made him fall into silence. Did she really see it? How did this woman see it? After a moment of silence, Brando said coldly. You want to bargain with me? Delphian shook her head weakly. I know what kind of person you are, Count. Sir, I only ask for a fair trial. Brando looked at the woman coldly, loosened his hand, and shook his head. I didn't intend to kill you myself, but you will get the trial you deserve. When we return to Abes, I will hand you over to Her Royal Highness. Even if he is an unforgivable criminal, I will give him the dignity he deserves. After saying this, he seemed to have relaxed. Brando pursed his lips tightly. To be honest, he wanted to kill this woman with his sword, or just choke her to death in anger. But at the last moment, he came to his senses, which made him somewhat regretful, but also somewhat glad. He deeply understood that he did not have the right to do so. He could take anyone's life on the battlefield, but he could not easily judge anyone. He had such power and authority, but the more he understood this, the more carefully he restrained the dark side in his heart. The higher one was, the more accustomed one was to controlling the fate of others, the easier it was to be blinded by power. The Silver Queen was not far from Yin Jian, and her end was enough to make one wary. Brando did not wish for the day to come when it was not only his enemies, but also the people around him who would be harmed by him. The Sage Realm was not only about power, but also the understanding of power itself. After all, this was the goodwill Martha had given to mortals. Otherwise, how different would it be from dusk? The darkness quieted down, leaving only the soft breathing of a man and a woman. But in the darkness, Brando saw a bright light flash in Delphian's light purple eyes. After spending some time with her, he understood what it meant. Delphian, I know what you're thinking, but I'm not pedantic. If the Nidevan family dares to interfere with the trial, I don't mind letting the Empire lose a noble family with a long history. Delphian looked up like lightning, biting her lower lip as she looked at him. You want me to die that badly, Count? You deserve it, madam. What if I'm one of your people? After a short moment of silence, the Prime Minister's daughter's somewhat low voice came from the darkness. What? Brando was stunned. Before he could react, he felt a pair of slender arms hugging him from behind. Then, a hot body hugged him tightly. Don't you want to save the Roman lady, Count? Delphian looked up, her eyes frighteningly bright in the darkness. She put her chin on his shoulder and said breathlessly, "I can make up for my mistakes. What do you want to say, Miss Delphian?" Brando did not move, and asked coldly. "The mystery of the emerald, my lord." Brando's heart skipped a beat. Although he had expected this answer, he did not dare to believe it so easily. He felt as if a poisonous snake had coiled around him and spat out apricots. "Do you think I'll believe you again, Miss Delphian? If I were your woman." The Prime Minister's daughter breathed hot air into Brando's neck. "Is it the same for Mr. Elman?" Delphian let out a whimper like an injured beast. Brando could feel her nails digging into his back. He could not help but suck in a breath of cold air, thinking that he had brought this upon himself. He instinctively wanted to push this venomous woman away, but when he lowered his head, he saw a glaring red. The Prime Minister's daughter had bitten her lip, and blood flowed down from the corner of her mouth, dripping onto his chest like stars. "My clothes," Brando could not help but complain in his heart, but he shook his head. He did not want to be so calculative with a woman. Even if she deserved it, she should not be ridiculed for no reason. "I'm sorry, Miss Delphian. It was a slip of the tongue." He placed his hand on the Prime Minister's daughter's shoulder, wanting to separate her, but Delphian held on to him tightly and whispered, "Take me, my Lord Count. Are you crazy, Miss Delphian?" "I'm not crazy. This is the only way you can trust me, my Lord Count. If you want to save your fiancé, you can only trust me," she said in a hoarse voice. "You don't have much time, and neither do I. Can you trust me one last time?" Delphine pressed her face against his body. The hair on her forehead was wet and drooped on her jade-like forehead. Sweat slid down the tip of her nose. She said softly, but her tone was very calm. Brando felt Delphine's hand fumbling for something on the bed behind him, but he did not pay much attention to it. He shook his head and said, "That's impossible, Miss Delphian. If you really want to atone for your sins, I have other ways." But before he could finish, Delphine had already stood on her tiptoes and wrapped her arms around the back of his neck, blocking his mouth. Brando's eyes widened. He felt a cold liquid pass through Delphine's mouth. The purple eyes of the Prime Minister's daughter met his gaze, and they were filled with pride. Chapter 1266. The Prime Minister's daughter looked at him with her purple eyes, full of pride. "Hofwald's golden wine, like a beautiful woman, is the best reward for the bravest man, my lord." Youth, Brando saw that the item in the Prime Minister's daughter's hand was his horn of commendation. He wanted to look back and say something, but after drinking the golden wine, his mind was on fire. F***ck, again, Delphine narrowed her eyes, looking at the man like a cat. "Tonight, I belong to you, my lord," she said with a fiery breath. As for the rest of the words, Brendel could not hear them clearly. The cabin swayed slightly, like the ripples on the surface of the sea. It was said that the mermaids would sing softly in the dead of the night, letting out a sobbing song, luring the sailors to drown. It was a shrill voice like that of a cat, accompanied by soft panting. It sounded like a mewling, as if it was weeping, and the two sounds were mixed together. That night, Huang Hua and Mr. Liu did not see Miss Delphine come up from the lower cabin. The first rays of the morning sun rose from the sea, dyeing the whole sea golden. South of the Towery Strait, there were some places in the depths of the Valtanis Sea that were said to be shrouded in darkness. Since half a year ago, the sun had not risen. However, the sea route was uninhabited, and very few people would go there. Therefore, the rumor was only circulated among a few people, and could not be confirmed. At least in the Towery Strait, the sun still rose and set. It was normal. The soft sunlight shone through the porthole, brightening up the dark cabin. The light shone through the snow-white bedsheets and the messy quilt, as well as the seductive snow-white back and shoulders and black hair that were exposed. Brando groaned and sat up on the bed with a splitting headache. When he saw Hofwald's horn of commendation, which was thrown at the head of the bed, and the Prime Minister's daughter beside him, who was pressed tightly against the soft pillow, he could not help but have a headache. Everything that had happened the night before came back to him. It had to be said that this daughter of the Prime Minister was known as the most beautiful woman in the capital. She was indeed a rare beauty. At the very least, since he had come to this world, her appearance and temperament could be considered one of the best among all the women he had seen. No one could even compare to her. Compared to Erwin's #1 beauty, Princess Griffin, this Prime Minister's daughter was more mature and knew how to make use of her charm. Compared to the #1 human princess under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, Princess Griffin's temperament was even more outstanding. She was like a poisonous snake tricking mortals into swallowing the forbidden fruit, full of deadly beauty. Of course, this was not an exaggeration. She was a woman with a heart like a poisonous snake. Brando knew it all too well. To be exact, even now, he did not dare to easily trust this woman. However, he did not expect that under such circumstances, he would still fall into her trap. However, he looked at Delphine, who was sleeping soundly and peacefully, and his heart was in turmoil. No matter what, this was her first time, and this Prime Minister's daughter had done her best to please her, so that night was not a bad memory. He couldn't do such a thing if he wanted to immediately turn hostile and ruthless. Although he knew that this was only an exchange of benefits. Brando sighed. Delphine seemed to feel his gaze. Her long eyelashes fluttered slightly, and she opened her eyes. When she saw Brando for the first time, her amethyst-like eyes did not reveal a proud expression, but a complicated one. If you knew this would happen, why did you? Brando looked at her expression and knew what she was thinking. He shook his head helplessly. It's too late to regret now. Miss Delphine, you were too impulsive, you regret it too, my lord. Delphine sighed softly, and asked softly with her magnetic voice. It's nothing. You have the right to go back on your words at any time. You said that because you knew that I would not do that, right? Brando said with annoyance. He realized that he did not know how to meet Bai Jia now. He would definitely be laughed at to death, not to mention the little Roman. Of course not, because no one can know the true face of others. The so-called playing with people's hearts is just self-deception. Delphine shook her head, and she smiled faintly. I have nothing left. I can only stake everything. As you know, I am always confident in my madness, because I am willing to accept any consequences. You are really a lunatic. Delphine calmly accepted such praise. But Brando still shook his head. Even so, I still find it hard to believe you. The Roman's life is still unknown. How do you want me to face him? The Prime Minister's daughter's face turned slightly pale. She bit her lips and said, I don't care about my own life. I can even tell you the secret of the Jadeite mystery, my lord. As long as the Nidwin family can survive. Nothing can last forever. But at least you can guarantee that he can return to his glory, right? Why are you always so stubborn, Miss Delphine? Everything should not be so bad. Why are you always so stubborn? Brando said angrily. I am stubborn. What's wrong with that? Delphine sat up on the bed, and the quilt slid down from her naked body. She stared at Brando and said, there are always stubborn people in this world. Besides, it is because of my stubbornness that you have my body, isn't it? Brando opened his mouth. He wanted to say that this was not his wish, but he could not say it. He could only admit defeat. Forget it. I don't want to persuade you, and I don't want to protect your family. If you can really make up for your mistakes, I will give you a chance to revive your family. Delphine's eyes flashed with a trace of surprise. You won't kill me. I didn't want to kill you from the start, but you won't be able to escape the judgment that belongs to you no matter what. But because of you, I have to kill you once. Brendel's tone was serious, but he suddenly changed the topic. Ah. Brando reached out and pressed his hand on the Prime Minister's daughter's forehead. Don't resist me. This is my first time with a living person. What do you want? Delphine was a little scared. Her face was a little pale. Compared to her boldness last night, she was a completely different person. But in the next moment, she felt a sharp needle piercing her brain. She couldn't help but scream. When the Prime Minister's daughter woke up, it was already an hour or two later. The moment she opened her eyes, she subconsciously touched her forehead. I died. She looked back at Brando. She clearly felt that she had died. Brando had directly used a spell to destroy her will. The feeling of death was so clear and despairing. But in the next moment, the Prime Minister's daughter reacted. She looked at Brando in a daze and said bitterly, "A planeswalker, I'm sorry." Brando looked at her and said, "I have no choice but to do this. I believe you should know why. But no matter what, I still welcome you to my camp. I hope you can adapt to your new identity. You're not from the Empire. The color of your hair and eyes shows that the Nidvan family has the blood of the Myrnas. They were also the first generation of necromancers. So the deck chose you, and I can't change it." The Dead Moon deck, the Prime Minister's daughter sat there in a daze. Then she revealed a calm expression and sighed, "If I lose my freedom, won't I become the Count's slave? A slave won't go that far." Brando thought of the Shire and Medisha, and thought that it wouldn't be that serious. He shook his head and said, "I won't interfere with your freedom too much, Miss Delphine. This is only to guard against your betrayal. This is the only way I can trust you." But before he could finish his words, his eyes widened as he saw Delphine crawl along the bed and press him down on the bed. The young girl lowered her head and said in a seductive voice in his ear, "Don't worry. It's okay, Count. I like this identity. This is the deal between us. Please let your slave serve you." The young girl licked his earlobe gently, and her breath hit his face. Brando looked at the pair of intoxicated eyes that were like amethysts staring at him. He felt a buzzing sound in his head. Damn, this crazy woman is a masochist. His mind was in a daze. He felt that he had mistakenly drunk Hofwold's golden wine again and was drunk in a daze. "Mr. Liu, is Miss Delphine all right? Why hasn't she come out yet?" Phoenix Fire was standing on the side of the ship, quietly looking at the wall-like fog rising from the Taoist Strait. She suddenly asked Mr. Liu, who was beside her. "I didn't see her at breakfast. It's been so long since lunchtime. I'm a bit worried. She has been taking care of my teacher day and night. Should I send someone to check on her?" Mr. Liu coughed slightly. "No need. I think Miss Delphine has her own plans." Phoenix Fire seemed to understand. She nodded silently. "Is Miss Delphine our teacher's fiancée?" "Probably." Mr. Liu glanced at the door leading to the lower deck and shook his head silently. At this time, Brando and Delphine opened the door and walked out of the lower deck. They obviously heard the conversation between Phoenix Fire and Mr. Liu. They were a bit embarrassed and couldn't help but blush. Phoenix Fire turned around and looked at the two with wide eyes. She said childishly, "Teacher, you're awake." "Ah, Miss Delphine. You look so beautiful today." The Prime Minister's daughter was startled, and then her face turned even redder. Author's note, I owe Brendel a lot of blood. I've already mentioned this in the group more than a year ago. Plus, the plot has already reached this point, but I'm still very careful when I write it. After all, I'm going against the wind to commit a crime. Damn, my character isn't good either. Seeing how conscientious I am, Bear Brothers, give me some monthly votes. Chapter 1267. Have you found a way to pass through this fog? Brando asked as he held the side of the ship and stared at the wall-like fog on the surface of the sea with a solemn expression. The Towway Strait ran from north to south. On a clear day, one could clearly see the coastline in the direction of the swift plane when looking east. But at this moment, the center of the strait was shrouded in a vast fog. The fog itself seemed to be motionless, like a wall perpendicular to the center of the strait. The dividing line was clear as if it was not affected by the sea currents and sea breeze at all. Brendel looked up at the sky. The weather was clear, and it was not cloudy or rainy. There was only a slight breeze on the sea, and Mr. Liu had mentioned that the sea conditions in the Taoist Straits were always good. With his limited knowledge of navigation, this was not a suitable weather for sea fog to form. The undead sailor lifted the thermometer under the water and reported a reading to Tarkus. The temperature difference in the sea was normal. Following the vampire's methodical style, the latter recorded the data and handed it to Brando. Brando glanced at it and thought that it was not a fog formed by evaporation. All signs indicated that the fog was not naturally formed, but there were too many ways to create such a fog under unnatural conditions. He first asked when the fog appeared, and was told by Tarkus that the fog began to appear on the surface of the sea not long after they went out to sea. But at first, the fog was very thin. At that time, looking east, one could still see the coastline of the swift plain. Not long after, there was a big explosion in Rosalind Harbor. After seeing the flash, Tarkus led 2 ships to approach the harbor, but they happened to encounter the Chariot's fleet. Moreover, Blanken and Sursta were still fighting on the ship. Tarkus made a prompt decision to join the battle. After sinking 3 of the Chariot's boats, he helped Blank capture the Chariot's flagship. In fact, that was how Delphian came to this ship. Of course, he also came here. Brando now knew what happened when he was in a coma. Before that, the Prime Minister's daughter told him the whole story in detail on the bed. When the big explosion happened, it did not have much impact on him. At least, it was not as serious as the after-effects of Hofwold's golden wine. When the Jadeite's sacred sword, the ancient phoenix jade amulet, and the strange thing merged into one, the terrifying energy wave produced was actually a majestic life force. He, who was the worst hit by the explosion, did not suffer any harm. Instead, he gained a lot of benefits. Not only him, but also the others present at the time. For example, Mr. Liu's misfortune was a blessing in disguise. Not only was his life force perfectly replenished by the ancient phoenix jade amulet, but his strength also increased. Among the 3 elders of the Phantom Chariot, except for the unlucky one who was completely dead, the other 2 were the same. The reason why Brando did not see them here was because they woke up earlier than him. As a result, they recklessly tried to seize control of the ship. Unfortunately, they did not expect that the Deputy Marshal of the Holy Cathedral of Fire's coalition army was on the ship. There was no doubt that he taught them a lesson and was still imprisoned in the lower level of the ship. Who was Blank? He was the White Wolf Sword Saint of Antiburo. His experience was so rich that it put Brendel to shame. If it weren't for the Earth Sword Saint Darius and the half-Buga Tolman, he would have been the number 1 person under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Therefore, although his strength had fallen below the standard, he could still make Brando suffer when he was not on guard. Not to mention the 2 elders of the Phantom Chariot. The latter's strength was about the same as his now, and they had not recovered from their serious injuries. It would be amazing if they could exert 70 to 80% of their original strength. They probably wanted to bully him with numbers, but they did not expect to kick an iron plate. As for what happened after that, it happened after he was unconscious. According to Delphian's narration, Fang Qi brought her back to the port to find the Jade Dragon's sacred sword. In the end, they happened to find him, Mr. Liu, and a few others who were unconscious. In fact, when the Prime Minister's daughter mentioned this, Brando really wanted to immediately meet this genius of the Phantom Chariot clan. He wanted to see if this guy's thinking circuit was too different from ordinary people, or if he was really lacking a string in his brain. When the original plan was messed up, the first thing he thought of was not to protect himself first, at least, to hide first and then send people into Rosaline to scout for information, but to go to the scene personally to find the Jade Dragon's sacred sword. This was a joke. The Jade Dragon's sacred sword might be important, but first of all, he had to consider what he could do, right? Otherwise, he might not be able to find the sacred sword. If he were to lose his life first, wouldn't he be the unluckiest person in the world? However, this genius seemed to have never considered this point. He also did not think about the reason why a supreme-class archmage thousands of miles away could not summon the holy sword back to him during a magic ritual. He simply plunged into Rosaline Harbor. As a result, unsurprisingly, he bumped into Blanche and the others. If it weren't for the Phantom Chariot clan's backup fleet in Rosaline Harbor, perhaps he and Delphine wouldn't even have the time to board the ship before they were stopped by Blanche and Insursta. But even so, it still gave Delphine an opportunity. The latter recognized Blanche, the old marshal. As the daughter of the Empire's prime minister, she was well aware of the deep friendship between Blanche and Darius in that era. Therefore, she left a mark immediately, allowing Blanche and Insursta to chase after them and board the ship. In fact, until now, Fang Qi still didn't know that Blanche and Insursta were able to catch up to them all the way because of this seemingly harmless young lady. He thought that he was too careless. In the end, both sides fought at sea and bumped into the two warships that Tarkus sent from the outer sea. Speaking of which, the Phantom Chariot clan was unlucky. According to Delphine, it wasn't that they didn't have any warships, but they were originally docked in Rosaline Harbor and were blasted into the sky by the explosion caused by the three holy objects. Although the explosion caused by the force of life was only beneficial to living creatures, it was no different from an ordinary explosion for inanimate objects. In fact, most of the casualties in Rosaline Harbor came from the rocks that were blown away by the explosion. In the backup fleet, except for the flagship, which was a smuggler's ship equipped with ballistas and cannons, the rest were some small single-masted ships without any armed forces. As a result, they were undoubtedly beaten by Madara's navy and were forced to surrender. Brando silently sensed the situation in his body. Like the other elemental orbs, he couldn't feel the power from the Jade Imperial Sacred Sword and the ancient Phoenix Jade Amulet at all, as if they never existed. However, he could vaguely feel that there was a vague connection in his will domain. It was like the gray light that rushed in at the end of the day, but he didn't know what it was. He also tried to take the initiative to contact that thing, but unfortunately, it was to no avail. But if it was said that he was puzzled at the beginning, he had long been used to it. Anyway, he could freely use the power of the sacred swords, including the newly added Jade Imperial Sacred Sword. As for what the elemental orbs wanted to do, they could do as they pleased. Brando had a somewhat self-deprecating attitude towards the strange things in his body. However, when he absorbed the nature orb, he could clearly feel that the inheritance of the Jade Imperial Sacred Sword was not complete. It was somewhat similar to the black orb that he encountered in East Metz. The other half of the nature orb should be in the legendary heart of the Jade Dragon. This was also Delphine's opinion. Brando knew that although the Prime Minister's daughter was too paranoid, her judgment was rarely wrong. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but turn his head and saw that the latter was staring at the sea in a daze. When she noticed his gaze, she nodded at him. Brando sighed and raised his head again to look at the sea fog in the distance that was perpendicular to the sea surface. According to Tarkus's description, the sea fog began to thicken shortly after they captured the Ghost Chariot's flagship and were preparing to turn north to follow the Rosaline's route to the Green Jade Hill. And it had been more than 3 days since he fainted. According to this, Brando could also silently delete the magic formation in his heart, because there was no magic formation fog that could last for 3 days on the sea surface that was full of ocean currents and sea winds. At this time, Mr. Liu at the side answered, "Mr. Tarkus let the Ghost Chariot's ship enter the area of the fog to test it." They went in for about 15 minutes and went back the way they came. According to the sailors above, they have been sailing forward, Tarkus continued. I read their memories. Those human sailors shouldn't be lying. Brando raised his eyebrows. Of course, he knew how reliable the method of the undead to read memories was. He couldn't help but pray for those unlucky people in his heart. Could it be the ghost chariots people who are playing tricks? If they had this ability, we wouldn't have captured them in the first place. Miss Huanghua, don't forget where this sea fog came from, Insta replied while wiping his sword. Insersta replied while polishing his sword. He sat far away from everyone and leaned against the mast in the middle of the ship. He polished the blade until it shone brightly, then raised the sword and reflected the sunlight brightly. However, Brando felt that this guy seemed to be deliberately shining the light on his eyes. He squinted his eyes and didn't care about it. Huanghua listened to Insta's words and nodded in agreement. Chapter 1268. Where are we now? Brando asked again. Tarkus looked down at the compass and said, north of Rosaline. Looking at the coastline in the west, we should be not far from the Green Jade Hill. Shouldn't this route be busy? Theoretically, it should be. But maybe because of this ghostly fog, the fleet from the Swift Plains is also blocked on the other side of the fog. Mr. Insersta, do you have any theoretical basis for this? It's just my guess, beautiful lady. Delphian came to the other side of the ship and glanced at the uneven coastline in the west of the Tawei Strait. There was an endless stretch of sea cliffs and reefs, and the waves formed a fine white line on the reefs. The crisscrossing coastline and dense reefs on the west coast of the Tawei Strait was also the reason why this area was so barren. Otherwise, it would not be so much more barren than the swift plains across the sea. But this coastline was not without good ports, or there would be no sea route. At least Rosaline was one, and there were the territories of the Death Lords and deep water ports in the north. What are you looking at? The others were not familiar with Delphian, but Brando was closer to her now. He saw her expression and knew what she was thinking. It's a little strange. Strange? The Prime Minister's daughter nodded slightly and gestured to the sailors not far away. Although it was the Death Fleet, there were still professional sailors. Some inherited the knowledge from their previous life, and some were trained. Madara also had its own navy, or they would not have crossed the sea to attack Saint Osol. She took a sea map from the latter. She opened the map and drew a line from it. The closest island to us in the north is Tyvid Island. There is a death port between this island and Saisam, but there is not a single ship in the sea nearby. This is too strange. It's not just the ships. Ignoring Tarkus' murderous gaze, Insersta reversed the blade and stabbed it into the deck. He then stretched and said, the coastline nearby is too quiet. Don't you think it's unusual? After his reminder, everyone came to their senses. Previously, they had not seen any ships near Rosaline. It could be understood that the Rosaline harbor had been blown into the sky, and the ships docked at the harbor had naturally been destroyed. As for the ships coming from the east side of the Tawei Strait, because of this fog, they were blocked on the other side, so naturally, not a single sail could be seen on the surface of the sea. However, the fleet had been sailing north for almost 3 days and was close to Green Jade Hill. Unlike Rosaline, this area was the busiest part of the Taiga Strait. Not only were there long-distance ships leaving Green Jade Hill, but there were also many small merchant fleets shuttling between Madara and the Swift Plains. These merchant fleets did not just depart from Green Jade Hill. Logically, some of them should have returned from Madara. How could it be so coincidental that not a single ship could be seen on the west side of the Tawei Strait? Moreover, even in the territory of the spirits of the dead, there were still humans living, especially in a place like the Swift Plains. The relationship between Madara and the 9 Phoenix humans was considered harmonious. Since both sides had business and trade, it was inevitable that there would be traces of human activity on the west coast. However, when they were close to the territory of the spirits of the dead, the west coast was dead silent. There was not even a trace of human activity. This was too strange. Everyone could not help but look at each other. What's going on? Mr. Liu also thought of this. When Miss and I passed by earlier, we could still see many merchant fleets. Maybe it's because of the fog. They've all returned to the harbor. Then there should at least be fishing boats. That's true, Huang Huo looked at Insersta. Mr. Insersta, you already knew something was wrong. Insersta shrugged. Isn't it obvious, my dear little miss? Why didn't you say so earlier? Because there's no need to, Tarkus muttered. According to the plan, we have to go to Gussel to replenish the supplies. So, no matter what, we will know what's happening on the sea. Where is Gussel? Brando asked. It's the harbor that Miss Delphian mentioned. It's actually very simple. There's no need to make such a fuss, Insersta interrupted. We don't have to go through the fog. We can just go by land. Go by land. I agree. Delphian nodded. She looked at the sea map, then replied, if we go by land through the south of the Sea of the Dying Moon, we can also reach Seat, Port of Eternal Death, and Deadwater Bay. Whether we take a boat there or go directly into the hinterland of Madara, it's fine. But if we do that, Miss Huang Hua and Mr. Liu may have to take a longer detour. She looked at the master and servant at the side of the ship. Mr. Liu and the little princess of the Jade Phoenix clan looked at each other. The latter shook her head and said, we're fine, Sister Delphian. If it weren't for the starfall, we would have gone to those places. Wait, go to the hinterland of Madara. Brando interrupted the two. Although he had a plan to go to the hinterland of Madara, he had never told the Prime Minister's daughter about it. In theory, they should be going to Erewhon. Moreover, if they went by land, wouldn't they be back to the starting point after going around in a circle? He suddenly felt a little annoyed. Delphian put away the sea map and folded it twice. Then she raised her head and said, Count, what do you think? On the surface, she was still the daughter of the Empire's Prime Minister. Because of her previous dealings with the old Marshal, Brando, she still called Brando Count in front of others. However, in private, she directly called him Lord. This. Brando suddenly saw Delphian bending down to put the sea map on the wooden table. She turned around and winked at him with her back facing the others. Of course, Brando didn't think that the Prime Minister's daughter was acting coquettishly with him. He pondered for a moment and realized that he couldn't find the origin of the fog. Cautiously speaking, naturally, Insersta and Delphian's suggestion was more appropriate. At the same time, he also asked the other party telepathically, what's going on? The mystery of Emerald. The Prime Minister's daughter frowned. It seemed that she hadn't fully grasped this ability yet. She only replied with 4 words. It's in Madara. Brando was shocked. But he suddenly realized that the player in history who obtained the Stagnant Realm, didn't he get it from the hands of an undead lord in the south of the Sea of the Dying Moon? Are you sure? Trust me, my lord. Brando nodded silently. The Prime Minister's daughter's ability was far beyond the word excellent when they worked together in Fathom Harbor. Moreover, she was also very famous in history. The flower of wisdom of crews. She was quite popular among the cruise players. On the other hand, in terms of the choice of route, Insersta also expressed the same opinion. These two historical geniuses had reached an agreement without prior consultation. This heavy weight was not something that he could easily ignore. No matter what, let's go to Gussel according to the original plan first. Brando took one last look at the sea fog and made the decision. Now, although they were on the ship of the undead of Madara, in fact, after Brando woke up, the command of the fleet returned to his hands. After all, he and Brando together were enough to decide the fate of everyone on the two ships. Moreover, for some other reason, the two leaders of Madara, Tarkus and Insursta, did not express any objection. Just like that. Throughout the day, from noon to afternoon, the fleet still followed the predetermined route to Tewade Island. Until the sun set, everyone on the ship, including the undead sailors on the watchtower, did not see any other ship on the sea. Amidst this strange atmosphere, the sun set below the jagged coastline from the west. As night fell and the stars rose, the sea near Tewade Island became even quieter. There were no gatherings on the small sailboats like there were on the floating ships. Besides, the undead did not need food, so the only living people on the ship had to prepare their own rations. Only Brendel and Delphine had special treatment. They were taken care of by the humans Tarkus had captured from the ghost chariot. It had to be said that in terms of these details, this vampire noble did not lose the demeanor of an old-school noble at all. But even so, the food was not necessarily rich. For example, Brando and Delphine's only dinner was a smoked mackerel with grapefruit juice and an avocado. If there was a need, they could add some bread and butter. But Brando really did not care about such junk food. Moreover, his body was close to the level of perfection, so he did not really need to replenish it. The Prime Minister's daughter, on the other hand, was eating delicately. She sat in front of the table in a very proper manner and carefully tore off the smoked fish strips one by one. Then, she placed them in her mouth with a fork and chewed carefully. It was a pleasing sight. "My lord, you don't need it." "I don't need it." "Do you mean you need me to serve you dinner?" "You think too much, Miss Delphine." The light of the candles in the cabin flickered, and the two of them occasionally had such a meaningless conversation. Brando once thought that Delphine was the model of a noble's daughter, but compared to her, there was a gap. The way this Prime Minister's daughter ate showed that she came from a noble family. She was very picky with her food, and it could be said that except for the most delicate part, she did not use most of the fish. Even though she restrained herself and did not say anything, he could see that she was very dissatisfied with the dish. He really doubted that this woman could fill her stomach. He could not help but shake his head, and handed over his plate of fish. Delphine was stunned for a moment, and looked up at him with charming eyes. "Do I need to say thank you?" Brando shrugged. "I'd rather you say something else, Miss Delphine. For example, about the jadeite mystery." Delphine paused for a moment, and reached out with her hand to brush the hair in front of her forehead. "I understand. P.S. There are still many gentlemen in the group. Students, this benefit was promised to you a year ago. In fact, I didn't want to write it, but seeing that I haven't updated for so long, I made it up to you. Don't take it too far, students, I don't want to die yet. Also, the little prince said that he doesn't want to be a king, and wants to be a queen. What the hell is that? Where are your morals?" Chapter 1269. Tewade Island was like a fortress hanging alone on the dark sea. There was a mountain on the island, and only the southern foot of the mountain could be seen from the Tawa Strait. The moonlight shone on the narrow waterway between Tewade Island and the west coast, shining brightly like a pool of silver foil floating on the sparkling waves. The promontory to the west of the island extended into the sea, blocking the view behind. There was a lighthouse on the promontory, but the light from the lighthouse did not illuminate the nearby waters. It stood above the sea level in darkness, like a night watchman standing under the curtain of night. A few nautical miles to the south of the island, 3 sailboats, 2 in front and 1 behind, were sailing with full sails, their stern drawing long trails on the surface of the sea. They were slowly sailing towards the waterway between Tewade Island and the west coast of the Tawa Strait. The sailboats moved at 6 knots and soon passed the promontory. Brando stood at the bow and saw the lighthouse similar to the ones he had seen in the Sea of Eternal Darkness and the Sublime Inland Sea. When the waterway was fully opened in front of everyone, he saw the harbor in the bay opposite Taywade Island. That's Gussell. Insursta also looked in that direction and said, "This is the territory of a few necromancers. Among all the dark nobles, they are the ones who have the most dealings with humans. They need materials, bones, and spellcasting materials. In short, it's very troublesome. This port was built by smugglers. At first, it was just an anchorage. Later, it gradually expanded into the embryonic form of a town. Most of the residents in the port are actually humans." Humans? Then what about the spirits? The one who spoke was a young man lying on the side of the ship. He was Exian's adopted son, the young man named Seabass. Although he had been greatly affected after learning about the relationship between Delphian and Brando, Delphian had lied about being Brando's fiancé, the young man's mind was as light as floating clouds, and now he seemed to have recovered. Phoenix Flame had promised the Rosaline family a position in the 9 Phoenix Kingdom. In fact, it was a fief outside the borders of the 9 Phoenix Kingdom. However, Lord Rosaline naturally could not abandon his foundation. The migration of his territory still required a long time to prepare, so the youth and Na Axion boarded the ship first. Undead rarely build settlements in fixed places. Apart from some cities in the Dead Moon Inland Sea, necromancers are more used to living in wizard towers. Although they also mine minerals and build workshops, they don't need to live in private places. Their settlements are usually castles, manors, or even cemeteries, Frank explained to Brando. It's a low-level undead, Insursta added. It was dark in the direction of the port of Gussell. They could only vaguely see the trestle extending into the sea under the moonlight. Seeing this scene, everyone had a bad feeling in their hearts. Although this era was not as brightly lit as the future, a human port should be at least a little bit of light, unless something had happened in the port. However, Brando, Delphian, Insursta, and Tarkus did not speak rashly. They all waited until they got closer to see the situation. For a moment, no one on the deck spoke. Only the sound of the wind could be heard. It was unusually quiet. Amidst this silence, the vessel entered the waterway of Tallweed, and plunged straight into the channel that led to the harbor. Not a ship or boat could be seen in the vicinity of the sea. Only on the starboard side of the vessel, a few chains away on the beach of Tallweed Island, gleamed with a deathly pale light under the moonlight, as if it were covered with white bones. Seeing this scene, the youth obediently shut his mouth. The ship quickly approached the port, but it was at this time that the weather was not on their side. Thick clouds drifted in from nowhere and blocked the moonlight, causing the visibility on the waterway to be reduced. The surroundings were shrouded in dense fog, and the light was dimmed by a lot. Among them, only the 2 undead, Tarkus and Insursta, were not affected. Brando could use dark perception to see far in the dim light, but after all, it was not like the undead. The way the undead used dark vision was different from that of humans. The 3 of them stared in the direction of the port. The port was densely packed with rows of 2-masted and single-masted ships. There were only a few large ships with masts like a forest, but there was not a single wind lantern on them. Not even a weak candle flame could be seen. There was no sign of human activity on these ships. Brando's gaze swept across the goods piled up on the other side of the trestle. The existence of these goods and ships meant that the port itself was not affected. So why was there not a single ship on the sea during the day? There are people in the port. Tarkus suddenly said quietly. What? There are people in the port, and there are people on those ships. We can smell the presence of life. Insursta squinted and looked at the port of Gussell solemnly. Are you sure you are talking about the ships docked in the port? Are they normal? Brando asked, pointing at the forest of masts. If it was in the port, it would be fine, but those ships looked like ghost ships. The ships were dark, and there were no wind lanterns on the stern or the masts. If it was only one or two of them, it would be understandable. But if all of them were like this, it was too strange. I didn't say they were normal, Count, but there are people on those ships. There is no doubt about it, unless someone deliberately used magic to mislead me and Tarkus. Enrich replied. How many people? At least 10 people, at most 20 to 30, distributed in the lower cabins. If you're talking about those ships, Enrich continued, the people in the port are distributed very evenly. Inside those buildings, it doesn't look like an ambush. In other words, everything in Gussel is normal now. Brando stared at the port of Gussel and frowned deeply. Do you think this is normal? Enrich shrugged. Seriously, I think it is very strange. Then Huanghua, Mr. Ryu, have you been to the undead port like this? Mr. Ryu shook his head. This port is a little strange. Even if there is a curfew, it shouldn't be to this extent. Do we still want to go ashore and take a look? Huanghua turned around and asked. Brando looked at Enrich. He was not familiar with this sea area, and as the local of Madara, the decision was obviously best left to the two dark nobles to make. Let's go closer and take a look. Tarkus pondered for a moment and replied. Lady Adney opened the cabin door and poked her head out to look at Brando and the others on the deck. She frowned, then sat back down on the stairs leading to the cabins below. She looked at her companions and whispered, make a decision. Quill, what should we do now? The knight gentlemen from Lubeck were surrounding their vice-captain and whispering to each other. The elven ranger was a little further away. He crossed his arms and leaned against the wall of the narrow aisle, pressing his longbow against his back. Hearing the other party's words, he looked up at Adney and shook his head gently. The only way now is to follow that person for a while. I think there must be a reason why Lord Ra's omniscient eye happened that time. Mr. Quill, we understand what you are saying. But the question is, in what capacity are we staying on this ship now? A knight asked softly. Of course it's clear, Quill replied. That person is the messenger of Ra. We can follow him completely. This is also the will of Lord Ra, it can be explained like this. The knight was stunned. What if he isn't? Adney was a little reluctant. Although she was only the vice-captain, after leaving Lubeck, she had been in charge of the team. No one was willing to give this power to a stranger. Moreover, it was with such a strange reason. You'll know when you see. Aren't our legs? There's nothing in the desert that can restrict the freedom of the wind and sand. Sigh, it's not that I don't support it. Adney sighed. I mean, let's change the way we say it. Change the way we say it. The knights were stunned again, thinking that there was no other way to put it. Captain, what do you think? Don't you think that Her Excellency the Emissary can hire us? Adney's eyes sparkled in the darkness. This is the difference between being paid or not. Our Lord Emissary looks very rich. Martha above, I knew it, the reputation of our knight order is all gone. We have let Lord Husai down. The knight immediately wailed and howled. The wailing from the other side even reached Brando's ears. He frowned and looked over. Those people were also the people he saved from the ghost chariot's ship. When he was not awake, Tarkus and Enrich thought that they were Blank's men, and Blank thought that they were his men. That was why he made a mistake and allowed them to board the ship. However, he could not chase them off the ship at sea, so he let them stay on the ship. He originally planned to let them off the ship when they reached Green Jade Hill, but he did not expect this to happen now. And Brando felt that those people were familiar, as if he had seen them somewhere before. He quickly calmed himself down and looked at the bow of the ship again. The ship had sailed into the Gulf of Gussel, and he could not see the guiding boat or anything else. The harbor was quiet. It was no more than half a mile from here to the Gulf. The silhouette of the entire harbor could be seen clearly, but there was still no sign of movement. It was as if the three ships did not cause any reaction when they entered the bay. Chapter 1270. What should we do? Enrich was a little confused. They couldn't possibly fire at the port. Gussell was under the joint rule of the three necromancers. Although they didn't live in the port, there were still their servants and servants stationed in the port. Moreover, in the far eastern region of Madara, although the necromancers here were nominally under the will of the Mercury staff, the Empire's influence here was far less powerful than imagined. Otherwise, he and Tarkus wouldn't have been sent to this place. To make matters worse, there weren't enough mid-tier necromancers on the two ships. They couldn't even send out sampans for reconnaissance. Can you still feel the breath of life? Both Enrich and Tarkus nodded. Let's go ashore and take a look. Brando replied. Although the port looked very strange, he was confident that with his current strength, he wouldn't encounter any trouble in this place. Naturally, it was impossible for three ships to enter the harbor if they wanted to go ashore. Of course, it wasn't impossible. Corsel was an excellent deep-water harbor, and it wouldn't be a problem for them to dock a few medium-sized sailboats. However, this harbor didn't seem as safe and reliable as they had imagined. If the ships were trapped here, they wouldn't be able to escape even if they encountered any problems. No one present was stupid, and they naturally understood this. Tarkus ordered two ships to lower their anchors, and the remaining ship of the Phantom Chariot drifted outside the port, waiting for an opportunity to move. The sailors on the ship had been replaced by Tarkus, and the captives of the Phantom Chariot were also imprisoned on another ship. Therefore, it wasn't wrong to call it the Ship of the Undead. Soon, 5 sampans were lowered from the side of the ship. In fact, there wasn't a need for so many ships, because only Brando, Enrich, and Mr. Liu were going ashore. There was still a need for one person to command the ship, and one expert to prevent accidents. The person in charge of command was naturally Tarkus, who was the calmest of all, and it was one of Brando's strategies to separate him from Enrich. The expert left behind was Brando. After all, other than Brando, there was no one else in the fleet who was more advanced than the vice-marshal of the Allied forces. However, at the last moment, Tarkus, who had been a little quiet, arranged for another 2 ships, which were filled with more than 30 low-level skeletons. Although there were no necromancers, Enrich could always personally command some low-level undead. The situation at the port was really strange, and cannon fodder was always needed. When they were about to board the ship, Adney and her subordinates came over and said that they wanted to disembark with them. Although it was a little unexpected, these people were all above elemental activation, and even had the strength of the elemental enlightenment. They also called themselves mercenaries, so Brando was naturally happy to have more people. He understood what these people meant, and since they were not short of money anyway, after promising a generous reward, these people asked for another 2 sampans. Finally, when the skeleton oarsmen began to row, the sampans slowly moved away from the fleet that was docked outside the bay and sailed towards the port of Gussell. There were 2 more people on the ship that Brando and the others were on. One of them was Huanghua. The little girl had boarded the ship with the excuse that she wanted to follow her teacher. Considering that the latter's personal strength was not bad, Brando agreed to her request. In fact, he originally wanted to test the little girl's courage. As a warrior, she could always hide in the back, and this princess of the Jade Phoenix family did not disappoint him. As for the other person, he was sitting directly opposite Brando, staring at him. He was dressed in fine clothes, and his long black hair hung down to his shoulders. If Brando did not know what he was here for, he might have thought that he was out for an outing. It was the genius of the Ghost Chariot clan that appeared once in 1,000 years, Mr. Fong Chi. Naturally, this person did not volunteer to board the ship, nor did he call himself a mercenary like Adney and the others. In fact, he had been under house arrest on the ship, so that the elders of the Phantom Chariot could not act against him. After all, it was not that easy to imprison a few people who were at the peak of the law and were close to supreme class. And now that he was here, it was Delphine's idea. Brando knew that the Prime Minister's daughter wanted this person to understand his current situation, so that it would be easier to carry out the next step of the plan. During his conversation with Delphine during dinner, he had a general understanding of what the riddle of the emerald was. Although the Prime Minister's daughter had stolen information related to it from the Rosaline family, finding the stagnation realm and obtaining the heart of the Jade Dragon was not as simple as solving the riddle of the Emerald Dragon. Moreover, solving the riddle of the emerald itself was not simple. The 5 sampans slowly rowed in the direction of Port Gaucel. The dark clouds in the sky still covered the silver moon, Timmy's, and the white moon, Ko Hua. It was pitch black all around, and only the monotonous sound of water could be heard in the darkness. That was the sound of oars entering the water. The pitch-black port ahead was like a giant mouth, causing one's hair to stand on end when looking in that direction. Brando, Insersta, and the others were fine, but Huanghua's little face was rather pale. She clenched her sword in her small hand so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. As a young girl who had yet to experience the world, her calmness when facing enemies was already surprising enough, but in the face of the unknown darkness, she was only 10 years old after all. How could she not be afraid of the dark? She subconsciously leaned towards Brando, as if this amazing teacher could give her some comfort. Who would have thought that the heir of the Jade Phoenix bloodline, my dear little cousin, would actually be afraid of the dark? Mr. Genius of the Phantom Chariot bloodline, who was sitting across from Brando, could not help but speak when he saw this scene. "I'm not afraid," Huanghua replied in a huff, trembling with anger. "Is that so? Is it fun to bicker with a child?" Mr. Liu interrupted the two. Fong Qi shrugged, and a jade pot and jade cup appeared out of nowhere. "Do you want to drink some wine to boost your courage? I used to do that when I was young." Brendel was a little speechless as he looked at this scene. Is this Ghost Chariot Clan's once-in-a-thousand-years genius talking about being funny? Does this guy even understand the situation he's in? Sure enough, Mr. Liu coldly blocked him with the hilt of his sword. "Don't give wine to a child." Fong Qi shrugged again. However, he quickly became interested in Brando again. He looked up and down at Brando and said, "I wonder what Miss Delphine likes about you." When Brando heard this, he almost spat out a mouthful of blood. He never dreamed that someone would be jealous of him for a woman whose insides were probably all black. If it were not for the fact that the other party was a summoned creature of the Dead Moon card deck, he would not have dared to get within 10 steps of Delphine. Otherwise, who knew when he would be schemed against? He couldn't help but take a closer look at this guy, trying to figure out where this idiot's courage came from. Could it be that he had been fooled by Delphine and had become stupid? Is Miss Delphine really your fiancée? It doesn't look like it. You are Brando, right? Are you a noble from the West? I heard that the people there are all country bumpkins. Is that true? To be honest, I don't think you are good enough for Miss Delphine. How about this? I want a duel with you. If you lose, you have to give Miss Delphine to me. Is that okay? Pfft. Huanghua couldn't help but burst out laughing. She blushed and covered her mouth, thinking that she was being too rude. Mr. Liu looked straight ahead and pretended not to see this scene. "Shut up," Brando said, unable to take it anymore. However, at this moment, his expression suddenly changed. He turned his head and looked down into the dark sea. Other than Huanghua, who reacted a little slower, Insersta Dragon and Mr. Liu stood up at the same time. With a sharp clang, the two of them unsheathed their long swords. "Careful, there is something under the water." 5 sampans were distributed in a wedge-shaped formation in the bay. The 2 undead cannon fodder boats were at the front, followed by the boats of the self-proclaimed mercenaries, Adeline, and the others. At this moment, the shout came from the other side almost immediately. Brando could not help but think highly of these mercenaries. Their alertness was outstanding. But what surprised him even more was Fong Chi's reaction. The genius of the chariot ghost, who appeared once in 1,000 years, had a funny look on his face earlier, but unexpectedly, his reaction was the fastest among everyone. Insurste and Mr. Liu had only noticed the abnormality under the water, but this guy not only had a long sword in his hand, but also turned to look in the right direction. When he noticed this detail, Brando realized that Fong Chi's reputation as a genius was not undeserved. In fact, when Fong Chi made his move, he noticed that Fong Chi's strength was much higher than Huang was. He was almost catching up with Mr. Liu. The difference in age between the three of them was quite big. However, it was almost certain that this guy should also be a chosen one. It was normal for a chosen one to have some flaws. However, what made Brando feel a little strange was that he could not see any flaws in Huanghua's body. Judging from her potential level, she should at least be a chosen one. This thought only flashed through his mind for a moment, and he quickly looked forward. While looking in that direction, he stretched out his hand. Two bright golden lines intertwined in the darkness, and the flaming blade Oderfice appeared in his hand. P.S. Delphian's card will be released tomorrow. Hee, it should be the unapproachable Fergie card. Chapter 1271. A huge wave surged out of the darkness. Brando held Oderfice in his hand and frowned when he saw the 100-meter-wide wave that connected the east and west ends of the bay. The wave was at least 6 to 7 meters tall. Wherever it passed, the ships in the port would be pushed back. The dense forest of masts rose and fell one after another like a pine tree. It was not something that his little dinghies could resist. "Fly!" Brando shouted to the others. At the same time, he grabbed Insursta by the collar and flew up from the ship. He could use his elemental force to stabilize the ship, but there was no need for that. Lowering the sampans to the shore was to not attract the attention of the people in the harbor. But now that the other party had discovered them, there was no need to lie to himself and others. Besides, he still had no idea what was under the water. Mr. Liu, Huanghua, and Fong Chi followed closely behind him. In Won't, as long as one had the strength of an elemental force, one could temporarily stay in the air. After reaching the Supreme Realm, one could even fly. Insursta was the only one present who did not have this strength. Insursta could not help but curse in his heart, thinking that he was really unlucky. He and Brando should not have come out this time, but he knew that White Tower's Gus's fleet was much more reliable than his. As soon as Brando rose into the air, Adney's reaction was not slow either. Two Knight grabbed Quill, and the others rose into the air. In the end, only the skeletal cannon fodder from the two boats remained on the surface of the water. As the huge waves came crashing down, the skeletal sailors were at a loss as to what to do. The seawater came crashing down, and the few sampans spun around like leaves in the waves before capsizing. In the blink of an eye, these cannon fodder had completed their mission. On the pitch-black surface of the sea, a white wave slowly swept past their feet, pushing the 5 overturned sampans out of the bay. At this moment, Brando saw what seemed to be a shadow swimming under the waves. With a boom, it flew up from the surface of the sea, carrying thousands of tons of seawater with it as it rushed towards the people in the air. "Be careful. Damn it, it's coming again." There was a cacophony of shouts in the darkness. "Enter the harbor." Brando looked at this scene without a change in expression and ordered the others at the same time. His calm voice made the others come back to their senses. The Knights of the Raw's Feather Knight Regiment were stunned. They instantly restored their order and immediately turned to fly in the direction of the port. Their orderly behavior attracted Brendel's attention. It was rare to see such a well-trained mercenary even in White City. But even in White City, there shouldn't be a single elemental tier mercenary, right? It wasn't that he didn't suspect the identity of these people, but he didn't put their strength in his eyes. Anyway, from the looks of it, he had picked up a big bargain. You guys go first. Brando turned his head. His voice was somewhat insignificant in the rumbling sound of the water. The wall of water was almost in front of him, and the height of 20 to 30 meters made it almost like a small tsunami. The strong wind blowing against his face made Brendel's long hair dance wildly. Teacher. Huang Huo was a little hesitant, but Mr. Liu was behind her. The latter dragged her back. He knew very well that the others would only be a burden to Brando if they stayed here. Before reaching the Supreme Realm, it required a lot of elemental power to stay in the air. If they fell into the water, it would not be fun. Brando turned his head and looked at the wall of water rising from the sea. Insursta, who was in his hand, could not help but remind him, "Damn it, be careful." After all, the latter did not want to be buried with Brando. But Brendel did not even move an inch. With a loud bang, the thousands of tons of seawater seemed to have crashed into an invisible wall and exploded, turning into rainwater that rained down from the sky. This is the power of the Supreme Realm. Insursta looked at this scene with his mouth wide open, and he could not close it. Brando frowned. This amount of seawater was nothing to him, but he did not catch a trace of the black shadow under the water. The shadow seemed to have disappeared without a trace in an instant. This was the first time something like this had happened in his field of law. He frowned and swept back and forth under the water with a few lines of law several times. After confirming that it was quiet again, he pondered in the air for a moment, then turned and flew in the direction of the port. Insursta could not help but let out a long sigh. In the name of the Dark Order, he complained, "Why am I always being carried like a bag of flour?" "I can put you down," Brando replied. The future star of Madara looked down at the dark sea and wisely shut his mouth. Brando looked at Fang Chi, who was beside him. "Why didn't you leave?" "I have a flying tool." "No, what I mean is, why did you stay?" "You told me to run away." Fang Chi looked incredulous. Brando looked at this guy, dumbfounded. Insursta was also a little speechless. He thought to himself that there really was a guy in this world who was more willful and arrogant than their king. But this genius of the Phantom Chariot had no self-awareness. His mind was still on the previous conversation. "So, Mr. Count, whether you agree or not, my patience is limited. If it's a duel, then forget it." "Then you agree to give Miss Delphian to me?" Brando rolled his eyes in annoyance. "I mean, I have no objections to teaching a little brat a lesson." "Ha!" Fang Chi couldn't help but laugh. "Little brat, Mr. Count, how old are you?" He was halfway through his sentence when he suddenly stopped because Brando suddenly turned his head and looked at him. At that moment, Fang Chi had the illusion that he was being stared at by some terrifying behemoth. The space around his body tightened, and then the magic tools and abilities on his body lost their effect one by one. His whole body fell toward the sea like a weight. "Ah!" This guy suddenly screamed. But before he fell to the surface, Brando picked him up. After all, he still didn't know what was under the water. He couldn't let this guy hang in this place for no reason. However, while he could avoid the death penalty, he could not escape punishment. When Fang Chi was set up again, his originally dazzling black hair was now like a drowned rat draped over his shoulders. Water droplets were everywhere, drenching his luxurious robe into a mess. When Insursta saw this guy's appearance, he couldn't help but laugh out loud. He was a little relieved that he was smart enough not to go against Brando. Otherwise, he might not end up well. Fang Chi looked at Brando with a murderous gaze. If looks could kill, Brando would probably die dozens of times before he stopped. "What, you want to try again?" Fang Chi didn't say a word. Apparently, he had learned his lesson. Brando nodded with satisfaction. He didn't need this guy's cooperation. He just needed to let him know that he was afraid. The three of them quickly crossed half of the bay and came to the sky above the port. Huang Hua, Mr. Liu, Adney, and her knight had already landed here. When Brando and the other two descended from the air, they immediately surrounded them. What do we do next, emissary?
Boss.
Lady Adney almost spilled the beans because of a slip of the tongue. She scratched her ears and cheeks as she corrected herself. Her face was so red that it seemed like it was burning. Not far away, Quill shook his head helplessly. The knight lowered their heads, afraid that they would laugh out loud. Brando looked at Insursta. Previously, they had made a lot of noise in the port. Even if someone was sleeping like a dead pig, someone should have woken up by now. But at this moment, the port was still quiet. This was definitely not normal. But Insursta frowned and shook his head. It's still the same. There's still the breath of life. Is it both?
Both.
Insursta nodded. In these ships, in the houses nearby. Brando looked around. The whole port of Gussel was like a dead city, but Insursta told them that this city was no different from normal. The situation at hand was really strange. It was even creepy. Even the female knight showed a look of displeasure when she heard it. She could not help but look around, afraid that a ghost would suddenly appear. She did not think that there would be a ghost in front of her, not to mention that there were 2 ships of skeletons with them. Insursta nodded silently again.
Where's the nearest one?
Brando asked again. Insursta raised his head and pointed at a warehouse not far behind Brando with his chin, indicating that there was the breath of life in that building. Brando glanced in that direction. It was a medium-sized warehouse about 100 feet wide and 20 to 30 feet tall. It was immersed in the darkness of the night. The style was very similar to the architectural style he had seen in Rosalind. From the outside, this warehouse was really ordinary, but it was really close to them. The closed door was almost in front of them. There was no movement behind the door. It did not look like there was anyone guarding it. He stretched out his hand in that direction and gently pushed. The door bolt automatically fell to the ground. He then pushed again and the door opened, revealing the dark space behind it. There's no one. Huang Hua spoke first. Brando also came to the same answer at the same time. He had Sky's eye and dark perception, so he knew the situation inside better than Huang Hua. There was not even a trace of goods in this warehouse, let alone people. It was empty inside. There was no hiding place at all. The others could not help but look at Insursta suspiciously.
Chapter 1272.
How is that possible? Insursta's expression changed. There must be someone inside. He's right there. As he spoke, he walked towards the warehouse, as if he wanted to point out the direction to the others. But Brando stepped forward and grabbed his shoulder. Don't go.
What's wrong?
Insursta was stunned.
Ah.
At this time, Huang Hua suddenly cried out in a low voice. She opened her mouth slightly and looked at the scene in front of her in shock. Just as Brando stopped Insursta, the warehouse in front of them suddenly changed. A few translucent figures that seemed to be made of fog suddenly appeared in that place. They were 2 guards and a human dressed as a warehouse manager. They seemed to be unaware of the existence of Brando and the others. One of the 2 guards leaned against the wall and was talking to the warehouse manager, while the other sat on a stool and lit his pipe. And from the beginning to the end, these people did not even look in this direction. Suddenly, they heard a burst of noise. They turned around stiffly and saw that the port seemed to have become busy in an instant. In the harbor shrouded in mist, ghostly workers and sailors were moving up and down the docked ships by the pier, moving goods. Others were operating the wooden tower cranes and cranes. A group of guards was on duty not far away. They were wearing overcoats and yawning as they stood under a street lamp that was not lit at all, supervising the work of these workers. The port of Guscell seemed to have come alive in an instant, as if the eerie silence of a moment ago did not exist. Everyone was stunned. What's going on? Adney was frightened. She held Quill's hand tightly and asked with a trembling voice. Are these ghosts? The legendary ghost city. But Insersta subconsciously wiped his forehead, although he did not sweat at all since he turned into an undead. He replied with a dry voice. They are not ghosts, these things are not even ghosts. Martha above, I don't know what these things are. I can clearly feel the breath of life from these people, but, these people are clearly in front of us, but we can't feel their existence at all. It's as if they are not in the same world as us. Quill finished his words and completed his sentence. Yes, that's right, Adney said immediately. Did you notice? Huang Hua suddenly whispered. She was surprisingly calm at this time, although her face was also a little pale. They can't see us either. What are they doing? Look over there, Huang Hua suddenly pointed in the direction of Guscell City and said. Everyone turned their heads and saw that on the main street connected to the port, carriages were parked. Hundreds of ghost residents were coming from that direction. Several long lines were connected head to tail, as if they were shrouded in fog. The fog moved forward slowly. Everyone in the line lowered their heads and staggered forward without saying a word. There were also a few knights around the team. They were different from ordinary people. They were riding on warhorses with grayish-white flames burning on their hooves. They held long spears that seemed to be woven from fog, and they were parallel to the long line. But everyone, whether it was the knight or the residents moving forward in the fog, had a heart-palpitating emptiness on their faces. There was no spirit in their gray eyes, as if they were simply moving forward for the sake of moving forward. After these people arrived at the port, under the supervision of the knight, they separated into several groups and began to board the ships in the port. Brando and the others watched these people walk up the gangplank one by one, their translucent bodies disappearing from the deck. They could not help but feel a chill down their spines. They're boarding the ships? Adney asked in disbelief. No, they seem to be migrating. This should be all the residents of Guscell City, right? Huang Hua frowned and said, Mr. Insersta, what kind of city is Guscell City? As far as I know, it's just an ordinary human town. Insersta replied in a tone that even he was not sure of. Are you sure it's ordinary? Madam Adney, I mean as far as I know, we can't stay here any longer, Brendel suddenly interrupted their conversation. His eyebrows were almost knitted together, and he said somewhat hurriedly, Let's go, we have to leave this port immediately. What's wrong? There's no time for nonsense, Brando grabbed Insersta's shoulder, don't touch the fog, don't look at those things, forget them. If you hear someone call your name, don't answer. Why? If you don't want to become one of them. Brando glanced at the vice-captain and said to the others in a somewhat dangerous tone. Adney shuddered. I know, Insersta finally reacted, this is, the unnamed. The Elven Ranger Nookwell also spoke at the same time, how can there be an unnamed here, this is not outside of order. Brando did not answer. He pursed his lips tightly. The unnamed may not be so terrible, but it was definitely not normal for them to appear in this place. Especially when he thought of the fog on the sea that divided the Torres Strait, he could not help but feel a storm in his heart. If it was as he expected, then there was only one possibility left. Everyone present also realized the seriousness of the problem, and followed Brando and flew out of the port. Teacher, Phoenix Fire looked down and saw that several of the ships in the port were full of people. The whole ship was surrounded by fog. She lowered the sailboat, which was also woven from fog, and then slowly sailed forward. The scene almost made her cry out in fright. She clearly saw a ship made of fog coming out of the ship. It slowly sailed into the port, and with the surrounding fog, it spread out of the port. Teacher, Miss Delphian and the others still don't know what's happening in the port. It was only then that Brendel regained his senses. What Phoenix saw also fell into his eyes. He saw warships made of fog entering the harbor, and the Guscell port was suddenly filled with fog. It was as if a ghost fleet was lifting anchor and setting sail. The fog spread quickly, and if Delphian and the others did not lift anchor now, they might not be able to turn in time. Insersta, signal Tarkus. He immediately said to Insersta, who was caught in his hand. The signal was a crystal that could emit a flash. They should have signaled the ship when they reached the shore, but because of this incident, it was delayed. However, the crystal could emit a yellow light, which was the most penetrating light in the fog. This crystal was prepared for them by Delphian in advance. Brando could not help but wonder if the Prime Minister's daughter had estimated something in advance. Insersta's true colors were undoubtedly revealed at this moment. After all, he was one of the future geniuses of Madara. After a brief moment of shock, he had now calmed down, opened his waist bag, took out the crystal inside, and sent a series of signals in the direction of the fleet. In fact, with Brando's own speed, he did not need to go through so much trouble. With his strength, he could return to the ship in the blink of an eye, but now he was not the only one here, and he could not leave one of them behind. Coupled with the need to guard against the ghostly thing under the bay, Brando instinctively felt that the thing was not like the Lost Names. The Lost Names rarely took the initiative to show aggression. As a result, the speed of the whole team slowed down a lot, and soon the fog rolled in from behind them. Strange. Seabass stared in the direction of the port of Guscell, and with some doubts, he saw that fog had started to appear on the waterway. A thin layer of fog seemed to have drifted over from the strait, but there was no wind at night. He straightened up from the side of the ship, and just as he was about to climb up the watchtower above the mast to see what was going on, Delphian patted him from behind. Seabass, go and pull up the anchor. She did not deliberately lower her voice, so everyone on the ship looked in this direction. What's going on? Nashin, who was measuring the depth of the water, pulled the rope out of the water and asked with some surprise. Miss Delphian, did you find anything? Brando looked up at the thin fog in the sky and asked. But of all the people, only Tarkus reacted the fastest. He frowned and pondered for a moment, then waved to his sailors and said, Listen to Miss Delphian. Raise the anchor, lower half the sail, and let the ship move. Delphian looked at the vampire nobleman with appreciation, then replied to the others, There must be a problem at the port. Regardless of what the Count and the others will do, we have to prepare in advance. She had not finished her words. A few flashes of light in the darkness came from the port. The Prime Minister's daughter's expression changed, and she immediately ordered everyone, Quick, raise the sails and let the ship sail. Fergie the unapproachable dead moon Dark 22, legendary creature human, necromancer. When Fergie the unapproachable enters the battlefield, if you do not use it from your hand, the summoner will immediately die and cannot be resurrected. Pay XMP, and the dead moon twins put Fergie the unapproachable, black derivative equivalent to the dead moon twins level -15, into the battlefield. When Fergie the unapproachable enters the battlefield, there will be X100, at least 1, counters. Whenever Fergie causes combat damage to a creature, the creature will be destroyed. It cannot be resurrected. Whenever Fergie causes combat damage to a planeswalker, the planeswalker will be killed. Whenever Fergie uses this ability to destroy a creature, the counter will be removed. When the counter reaches 0, she can no longer use this ability. Fergie the unapproachable lasts until it is reset. Death is eternal life. Chapter 1273. In the blink of an eye, the bay near the port of Gussell was already shrouded in mist. Brando and the others were already very fast. While keeping an eye out for the thing under the water, they had already flown to the entrance of the bay in a few breaths. But what made it difficult for them was that the speed at which the mist was spreading was not inferior to the speed at which it was spreading. One by one, the mist sailboats were leaving the port at an unusually fast speed. The mist followed them closely and caught up with them in the blink of an eye. Suddenly, two cloud walls rose from the mist and formed the shape of sails. There were 4 layers on top and bottom, and they crashed forward majestically. Everyone quickly spread out from the left and right sides, but with just a slight delay, the mist surrounded them from all sides. Brando held the Enrich dragon in one hand and stretched out his other hand to release 2 streams of air, tearing a hole in the mist on the left and right. Seeing this, the others quickly followed suit. Although most of them were not necessarily elementalists or wizards like Brando, their magic equipment, swordsmanship, or special abilities might have a similar effect. Quill was held in the middle by 2 knights. He took out his longbow and shot a few explosive arrows in front of him. The air generated by the explosions blew away most of the mist. The effect was even better than Brando's spell. Adney held her sword with both hands and slashed forward. A white blade of light that was dozens of feet long flew out and tore a hole in the mist. The knights also activated the magic rings or necklaces on their hands. Fireballs, wind blades, and icicles appeared out of thin air. It was very lively. However, the one who stood out the most among them was Phoenix Fire. The little girl carried the will of the Jade Phoenix. She seemed to be holding a burning flame in her hand. Once she attacked, a sea of fire spread out and burned the fog in front of her. On the contrary, Feng Qi and Mr. Liu, who were stronger, did not make any contributions. The swordsmen of the 9 Phoenix rarely relied on the power of external objects. Except for some special jade pendants and jade talismans, they rarely carried magic equipment. At this time, the 2's swordsmanship was obviously useless. Just like that, with the Phoenix's fire leading the way, everyone forcibly opened up a path through the fog. Although the path was visibly becoming smaller and narrower, it was enough for everyone present. They quickly flew forward along the passage. On both sides, there were ships traveling in the fog. These ships had almost merged with the fog. The parts of the ships that were in contact with the water seemed to be non-existent, leaving only the fog rolling on the surface of the sea. It was as if these translucent ghost ships were moving forward. It was extremely strange. Even Brando did not dare to approach these ships. The lost names were too mysterious. Few travelers who encountered the lost names in the wild were spared. In the Black Forest outside the World of Order, many people disappeared silently from the world because of them. He didn't want to experience what happened in the Deadly Frost Forest again. Although he had some experience, he didn't dare to say that he had 100% confidence in dealing with these things, let alone on the surface of the sea. Damn it, look ahead. Enrich suddenly shouted from below. Brando raised his head and looked in the direction he was pointing. He suddenly frowned. The dense forest on the hillsides on both sides of Gussell Bay was covered in fog at some point. The fog rose dozens of feet above the forest and spread rapidly toward the lower bay. In the blink of an eye, it was about to block the entrance to the bay in front. Everyone's face was a little pale. They could clearly see that the fog that was spreading to the sea would block the way out first. Speed up. Brando no longer cared about the strange thing under the water and said to the others. Everyone's speed suddenly increased, but Brendel was one step behind. With one hand on Oderfeiss's hilt, he inadvertently glanced down, just in time to clearly see a black shadow sweeping across the surface of the water. Without saying a word, he directly slashed down with his sword. A golden red line flashed in the darkness and smashed down into the sea. The surface of the sea instantly boiled and exploded. The black shadow suddenly jumped up from the sea and pounced in Brando's direction. The water splashed all over the sky, like rain falling down one after another. In the curtain of rain, Brando could clearly see that the thing didn't have a body, but the surrounding fog naturally outlined its outline. The fog spread out its wings and its shape was a little like a huge manta ray, but no manta ray could fly in the sky. When Brando saw this thing, he naturally thought of Ekka's nightmare he saw in the loop of trade winds. He didn't even think about it and punched forward. The space in front of his fist cracked inch by inch, shattering into a circle of ripples that could be seen with the naked eye. This ripple spread forward and affected the monster like a sound wave. Wherever it passed, the monster would also break inch by inch, and in the blink of an eye, it had been smashed into pieces. At this time, Brando turned around and the lines of law expanded to several kilometers in an instant. The silver line flashed across the sky and swept across the entire Guscell port like a sharp blade. Everyone who saw this scene was shocked, including Adney and Quill. Although they had seen Brando in action when he was in Rosaline, the strength that Brando had displayed at that time could only be said to be alarming, and not as terrifying as what was happening now. When the knights saw this scene, they almost stopped in their tracks. It was a sense of despair that came from the gap between their strengths. In the blink of an eye, a glimmer of hope appeared in these people's hearts, because at this time, someone with such strength was their ally. Huang Huo clenched her fists in excitement, her eyes shining. Fang Qi covered his mouth, as if he had realized something. For a moment, he looked a little absent-minded. Mr. Liu was disappointed. He glanced at Huang Huo, then at Brando, and then at Fang Qi. He couldn't help but sigh. However, Brando raised his sword toward the forest on the west coast of Guscell. The tip of the sword lit up slightly, and a golden line flashed across the night sky, piercing straight toward the gentle ridge line there. Few people knew that this sword was the real Flash Strike sword art. The complete version of the Flash Strike sword art did not require the user to move at all. The attack could be done at will. Wherever the user's eyes and thoughts reached, everything would be under the sword's edge. Like the brightest light of thought in the darkness, it flashed and disappeared. Unfortunately, no one present even understood it. They thought that Brando had used some kind of magical ability, not a swordsmanship. The bright light left a long visual residue in everyone's vision in the darkness, but they felt that this attack did not have the effect they had imagined. After a flash of the golden line, it disappeared without a trace in the forest over there. They looked at Brando, but Brando did not look over there. He turned around and flew in their direction. No one present was an idiot. They already knew that someone was lying in ambush in the direction of the forest, and the underwater thing must have been made by the other party. But as for whether the other party had anything to do with the current lost name, it was hard to say. Teacher. Huang Huo was a little excited and leaned forward to say something. But Brando shook his head at her, motioning her not to speak. At this time, the fog in front of the bay had begun to close. If they did not hurry, it would be too late. In fact, it was already too late. The fog spread to the sea from the east and west, and had begun to seal the entrance. Behind them, the huge fleet in the fog was coming head-on. Teacher, you go first. Don't worry about us. Huang Huo finally could not help but say. In the Nine Phoenix, people respected their teachers as if they were their parents. She naturally knew that her teacher had stayed behind to wait for them. If he was alone, with his strength, he would have returned to the ship long ago. In any case, she did not want to be the one who dragged her teacher down. Behind her, Mr. Liu seemed to want to say something but hesitated. He knew that the future of the Jade Phoenix bloodline could not be lost in this place, but he could not bring himself to ask Brendel to disregard his own safety to help. Fang Qi, on the other hand, seemed a little calm. He only looked back with a slightly troubled expression. Clearly, he had another way out. Brando noticed this detail, then shook his head at Huang Hua and said, "Follow me closely. Things have not reached that point yet. I am not so weak that I can't even protect my own students." Teacher, Adney and her knights had long since fallen into chaos. Although this vice commander was somewhat muddle-headed, she wasn't someone who could remain calm in the face of death. Amongst the group, it was Quill who was much calmer. "We're dead. What should we do, Quill?" she said loudly, a little panicked. "Captain, it's not that bad yet. Mr. Brando hasn't abandoned us yet," Quill replied. "But we've only met him face to face. Do you trust him that much?" "I trust in Lord Ra's guidance." Martha above, these words sound a little like those old guys in the Holy Cathedral. Hearing this, Quill shook her head. But just as everyone's face was solemn, someone suddenly stared in the direction of the bay and exclaimed, "Ships!" Everyone followed the sound and looked ahead, only to see the outline of several warships faintly appearing in the fog. At first, they thought it was another fleet of the Lost Names, and their hearts fell into an abyss, thinking that there were pursuers behind and interceptions in front. This time, they were doomed. But upon closer inspection, they found that the ships were somewhat familiar. Was it not the ship of the ghost chariot that was captured by the undead of Madara? "Oh my God, it's one of us." Chapter 1274. It was as if a kind of joy had arisen spontaneously from a desperate situation. Everyone was overjoyed and hurriedly flew in that direction. But Brendel was not too surprised. In fact, he had seen the ship a long time ago. It seemed that leaving Tarkus and Delphine on the ship was the right choice. The two of them did not make any mistakes at this critical juncture. Although the fog wasn't as dangerous as he had imagined, if he really had to break through the fog, the number of people around him would probably be reduced by a lot. At most, he could only protect Insursta and Phoenix Flame. "Phoenix Flame, come here." The fog that came from the harbor had occupied more than half of the harbor. Phoenix Flame was the weakest among all of them. He did not dare to waste any time and extended his hand to her. Phoenix Flame was not shy at all. She quickly grabbed Brando's hand. Obviously, she knew that this was not the time to be particular about etiquette. She could not let everyone wait for her. In a few breaths, everyone landed on the ship one by one. As soon as Brando boarded the ship, he saw Delphine at the side of the ship looking in his direction. When the Prime Minister's daughter saw him, her eyes lit up and she quickly walked over. "Why are you on this ship? Where's Tarkus?" Brando put down Phoenix Flame and Insursta's dragon. Although he had expected this, he could not help but ask. The Prime Minister's daughter quickly sorted out her emotions and replied quickly, "He's on another ship. I insisted on coming. The other two ships are outside on the waterway between Tayweed Island and Gussel. They're waiting for us to join them. If necessary, we can abandon this ship." Brando nodded in satisfaction. He felt that keeping this woman by his side might not be a complete mistake. At least at this time, she could be said to be the only person he could use. If he left Tarkus alone, he would not be completely at ease. "You've done well. The others have to thank you. But you don't have to come to this ship personally. I will do my best. If I can't see you safe with my own eyes, I won't be at ease. I have to watch the Nidvins revive." Brando scrutinized the woman's light purple eyes. The Prime Minister's daughter walked up to him and adjusted his collar. "What should we do next?" she asked. "Guzzle is done for," Brando replied. "We have to leave this place immediately." "What's going on?" "It's unnamed," Brando said as he walked in the direction of the gangway. "This fog." He nodded. Delphine's expression changed, and only then did she show some lingering fear. Unlike the people of Jiufeng, the legend of the lost name was widely spread in Woned. Unlike those shallow aristocratic socialites, she, who was knowledgeable, certainly understood the heavy meaning of the word. Then she realized something, and her expression changed again. She bit her lower lip and followed Brando's footsteps. She lowered her voice and asked, "The fog on the Taoist Strait?" Brendel nodded silently. He knew that he couldn't hide anything from this woman. Her mind was too sharp. "I hope I'm wrong. Otherwise, the swift plains would be finished. At least the coastal areas would be finished. I don't know what happened to the green jade hillock, but..." He shook his head as he spoke, and stopped at the gangway. Before they landed on the ship, Delphian had already ordered the ship to turn. Although they were temporarily safe, the situation was not as good as they had imagined. The ship made a turn in the bay, but the fog on both sides could not be stopped. But since they were on the ship and had their feet on the ground, they could free their hands to disperse the fog. Even so, the wall of fog on the surface of the sea was getting closer and closer. It was like a long and narrow strait, and it looked as if it would squeeze together at any time and crush them to smithereens. Needless to say, the fog coming out of Gus Cell was getting closer and closer. The fleets within the fog were almost right in front of them. Brando looked at the scene with a solemn expression. If necessary, he would have to give the order to abandon the ship. Fortunately, the speed of the ship was faster than expected. Soon, he heard a cheer. Behind the closing fog, there was a gap. Not far away was the Corsal waterway. Tarkus and his two ships were a few miles ahead, slowly moving towards the northern exit of Tewade Island. The moon had reappeared from the clouds, and the sea was frighteningly bright. At the very last moment before the wall of fog closed, the ship finally leaped out of the fog and entered the waterway between Tewade Island and Port Gus Cell. "Raise the sails, quickly, quickly. You damned lazy bones, didn't the necromancer who summoned you teach you how to raise the sails?" Insersta's voice rang out from afar. The people on the deck heaved a sigh of relief. Some even ran over to Delphian to thank her. The Prime Minister's daughter always maintained a polite smile in front of these people. Brando looked in the direction of Port Gus Cell one last time, then turned around and pushed open the cabin door beside the gangway. He lowered his head and went in. Delphian hurriedly followed. The two went straight into the drawing room. The Prime Minister's daughter seemed to know what he was going to do. She took out a scroll of the sea map from the cabinet beside her and spread it out on the table. The sea map clearly marked the Taoist Strait, Swift Plains, Green Jade Hill, and the coast of the Sea of Eternal Darkness. The furthest point was Crete Island to the south of St. Tassol and east of White Mountain. That place was less than 1,000 nautical miles away from Erewhon. It could be said that it was the easternmost and southernmost point of Wonde. Brando wasn't familiar with the geography of the East, but that didn't stop him from knowing where the Taoist Strait was on the Sea of Eternal Darkness. He saw the Prime Minister's daughter pressing her hands on the sea map, using a compass and a ruler to draw an arc. Delphian's black hair hung down on the sea map, but she didn't notice it. She frowned and bit her lips as she calculated carefully. Then she drew another line. That line was originally directed to the north of the Sea of Eternal Darkness, going up the Kherson Strait and into the Sea of Fallen Stars east of St. Tassol. At the end of that line was the Great Glacier. Brando knew this line. On this line was the area where the lost names appeared most frequently. If the sea map continued to extend east, then the line would connect to Erewhon. It landed on the coastline north of the Deadly Frost Forest, crossed the entire Deadly Frost Forest, then entered a wreck from the south of Lantern Island, passed through the great ruins under Feyre, and entered the territory of Princess Vladapes. There was a natural black forest on the southern border of this territory. Since the early days of the First Era, there were often sightings of the Army of the Lost Names there. Then it continued to move east into the Sea of Glittering Light. From there to the north, there were many sightings in the Temple of the Earth and along the coast of Hazel. In theory, this line should have circled the entire wound. Many people once thought that the lost names were circling the entire wound, but no one knew what their purpose was. It was just obvious that the lost names only landed in the northern peninsulas of Erewhon, White Mountain, Hazel, and the forests of the southern border of the Ring of the World, a few areas of Ludwig north of Cruz, and the north of the 10 cities. Most of the time, their route was actually at sea. But now, this route had undergone a great change. Originally, it was supposed to go north from the Kherson Strait, but now, it had undergone a 180-degree reversal. Instead, it had turned south and plunged straight into the Kherson Strait. If he guessed correctly, after the line went south into the deep sea, it would turn east again and circle back to the Great Glacier from the north of 9 Phoenixes, continuing its cycle. But Brando and Delphian were both looking at the position of the Kherson Strait at the moment. If I'm not wrong, the Prime Minister's daughter looked up after calculating the last line. At this moment, the moonlight just happened to pass through the porthole and shine on her face, making her look a little pale. Something should have changed in the Kherson Strait, causing the marching route of the lost names to deviate. Now it's inserted south into the Kherson Strait, and the entire Swift Plains should be covered by it. Brando shook his head. The Kherson Strait has been cut off. What? The Prime Minister's daughter was stunned. He suddenly remembered something. It was the Bugis. The Slate War had begun, and it began with the floating city of Massenger falling into the Kherson Strait. The disaster of White Mountain, there was no mention of the upheaval of 9 Phoenixes in history, but now that he thought about it, Madara did not eventually invade 9 Phoenixes at that time, perhaps because of this incident. It was just that the East had not yet been opened at that time, and the players had too little information. He frowned, and for a moment he did not remember if the connection between Erewhon and 9 Phoenixes had been broken for a period of time at that time. Unfortunately, it was the last period of Erewhon's life, and other than the bloody battle with Madara, there were no relevant details in his memory at all. Perhaps there was, but it wasn't the main information. Naturally, he couldn't remember all these minor details clearly. He was thinking, and Delphian naturally did not speak. But at this moment, the door creaked open, and Insersta came in from the outside. When he saw the two of them, he immediately said, "You're here." Brando and Delphian turned their heads at the same time. The future star of Madara gestured to them, "Count, I think you'd better come out and take a look." "What's wrong?" "I think we're in big trouble." Chapter 1275. When Brando returned to the top deck, the ship was sailing out of the waterway between Tewade Island and Port Gussel with full sails. The two ships of Tarkus in front had also slowed down, waiting for them to catch up. On one side of the sea was the rugged rocks of Tewade Island, which looked as white as phosphorus under the moonlight. The wind blew from the south of Gussel, causing the hull of the ship to sway slightly with the waves. Since Timmy's had passed through the clouds, the visibility on the sea was extremely high. He could clearly see the wall of fog moving slowly on the east side of the Therese Strait. There seemed to be countless ships in the thick fog, stretching out endlessly. The ships formed a wall between them, and the masts were faintly discernible. There were hundreds and thousands of ships in the wall. What made his face turn sour was that the fog was slowly approaching the west coast of the Torres Strait, which was where they were. It seemed that the fog was going to merge with the fog coming out of Port Gussel. This was not a big deal, but the problem was that their three ships were sandwiched in the middle. There was a dead silence on the deck. The people who were celebrating earlier were now speechless. They were still confident that they could pass through the thin fog in Port Gussel, but the wall of fog in front of them stretched for hundreds of miles, and they could not see the end of it on the wide sea. It was impossible to go around it. When Brando came out with Delphian and Insersta behind him, everyone subconsciously looked at him. Previously, he had led them out of the Bay of Gussel, and everyone subconsciously thought that Brando was the one who could solve the problem at hand. But Brando was actually unsure at the moment. He looked at the wall of clouds moving slowly on the surface of the sea with a solemn face, and he could not make up his mind. Tarkus had once sent a ship into the fog, and the ship returned the way it came, seemingly unaffected. But the state of the fog at that time was not the same as now. As for going around it, that was a joke. The fog had appeared since Rosaline, and they had been sailing north for 3 days without seeing its end. Who knew where the other end of the fog was? But the fog of Port Guscel was coming from the waterway behind them, and it seemed that the only thing they could do now was to continue sailing north. If there was no other way, they could only abandon the ship and go ashore. The fog could not go too far into the land. Although the ports along the coast had suffered, there were always safe places inland. It all depended on whether they could travel that far in a short period of time and leave the area covered by the fog. Brando turned his head and asked, "What's the terrain in the north? Is there a suitable place to go ashore? It would be best if it's a harbor that can shelter from the wind, and has mountains or hills nearby." Insersta thought for a moment, then replied, "Yes, there are, but there are places like this that have all become harbors, Count. Of the ports in other places. Of the ports in other places. And. However, due to the steep terrain of the western shore of the Taoiseach Strait, there were not many places to build a harbor. Therefore, the few places that were available were all used by humans or undead. It was really difficult to find a natural and undeveloped anchorage. I know of such a place, teacher." At this time, Huang Hua came over and looked at them. "What? But I've never been there. I've only heard of it. I heard that there's a pirate hideout in the Bay Canyon near Sopalach. I think if the pirates can use that place as their lair, we can also go ashore there. I've heard of that place too." Insersta seemed to be reminiscing, but there was not much joy on his pale face. "But no one knows where the lair is. The fjords near Sopalach have a complicated terrain. If we find the wrong place, we'll be in trouble." Brando looked back at the dark sea between Taoide Island and Guscel. The fog spread faster under the influence of the south wind, and the wall of fog on the Taoide Strait was coming in their direction. They did not have many choices left. "It's better than waiting for death," he replied. "We have to try. How far is that place from here? Can we get there in time?" "It's not far." Delphine knew the question was directed at her. She had already memorized the map of Swift Plains. Sopalach is north of Guscel. It's only 100 nautical miles from here. It's one of the largest ports on the other side of the strait. But the history of this port is actually very short. It was only discovered during the year of the spider poison. But Sopalach has a wide belly and a narrow mouth. It's a natural shelter from the wind. The water in the port is more than 8 meters deep. It can accommodate almost all kinds of merchant and military ships in the Nine Phoenix region. It's an excellent natural port. It's said that it has the conditions to build a spaceport. 100 nautical miles was a distance that would take a normal person several days to cover on land. But it was not a long distance on the sea. The 3 ships were excellent armed merchant ships. The fastest could reach 12 knots with full sail, and the slowest could reach 10 knots. With the south wind blowing, they should be able to see the coastline of Sopalach by tomorrow morning. But that was only in theory. Only the heavens knew if the fog would actually give them that much time. Even though Brendel had some knowledge of sailing, he was not completely clueless. He could not calculate how fast the fog was moving on the surface of the sea, but at least he could tell that it was definitely not going to give them 10 hours of time. Half of that was good enough. Is the surrounding terrain very complicated? Sopalach is on the glacier belt. To the east is the southern edge of the Nine Phoenix Great Glacier. The movement of the glacier and the erosion of ice and snow easily created the complicated sea cliffs and fjords. In fact, the entire coastline of the western side of the Torres Strait is affected by similar geological changes. Only in the warmer area on the southeast side of the strait, the rivers after the melting of the glacier formed the alluvial plains. Brando understood. The Great Glacier of Wonde was located to the east of Fanzin and to the north of the Great Plains of Saint-Tassol. But the term Great Glacier was actually a broad geographical concept. Its part in Wonde was only its westernmost edge. This glacier, or ice sheet, was a more appropriate name. It was the impasse to the west of Wonde. It was also the largest part of the Black Forest, outside the borders of Wonde. Of course, the Black Forest was far from just a forest. This glacier extended to the east, and no one knew where its boundary was. It then went south across the Kherson Strait and intersected with part of the border of Madara. After that, it crossed the Torres Strait and became a huge part of the impasse on the northern border of the Nine Phoenix Great Glacier. And this part of the Nine Phoenix Great Glacier was the thing that the Prime Minister's daughter mentioned. Brando pondered for a moment and looked at Insursta. Go and signal Mr. Tarkus. We are heading north. Our destination is Sopolach. By the way, how many liches do you have on board? Must they be middle-ranked or above? He suddenly asked. Insursta was stunned for a moment and did not understand the meaning of this question. Not many, Count. Including the adjutant on this ship, there are no more than 5. So few. Brando was a little puzzled. He knew that in Madara, liches were the most important part of the army. It was not an exaggeration to say that they were the backbone of the army, especially in this era where their undead summoning magic had not been improved. There were no elite skeleton warriors at the basic level, no assassin undead, and no cheap necromancer apprentices. Liches were the most important mid-ranked and low-ranked commanders of the undead. Moreover, liches were Madara's most precious and rare technical troop class. Like the Navy, before the appearance of the intelligent elite skeleton warriors, the general skeleton warriors were at most used as cannon fodder. That was to say, they were used in boarding battles or landing battles. If they were used as sailors, they could at most handle simple tasks such as cleaning the deck or rowing the ship. In fact, only liches with a certain level of intelligence could be qualified as professional sailors. How could there be only 5 professional sailors on such 2 large ships? Brando was a little puzzled. In Rosaline, we usually use humans to supplement the sailors. The humans here often deal with us. If we can afford it, they won't mind working for us. After all, we are not a real warship. It is impossible for mid-ranked liches to be equipped with so many of them. Those things are also very precious to us. Insursta shook his head and smiled bitterly. Actually, there are still some in Rosaline, but we didn't think of bringing them out. What do you need them for? Brendel was a little speechless. Professional human sailors were actually stronger than necromancers. Middle-ranked necromancers had intelligence, but there was a limit to it. High-ranked necromancers were no different from humans, or even better. But how many of them were there in Madara? Most of them had become undead lords. However, it was a pity that what he needed now was not professional sailors, but liches. Although liches could be sailors, their real function was not only to be sailors, but also to be part of the mid-ranked and low-ranked officers in Madara. More importantly, they were all mages. Although it might be a little lame. But that was enough. Seeing that Brando's expression was a little unpleasant, Insursta, who had learned to read people's expressions these days, quickly said, but there are still many low-ranked liches, Earl. Brando shook his head. No need. Let Tarkus gather the mid-ranked liches and send them here. I want to do something, and I need a few mages to help. Chapter 1276. Insursta finally understood why Brando only wanted mid-level necromancers. Low-level necromancers that relied on bone staffs to cast spells obviously couldn't be called mages. They didn't have the ability to cast spells themselves. The vice-captain of Pull's Feathers, Lady Adney, had come over at some point. She heard their conversation and couldn't help but interrupt. Actually, I know some magic too. Brando turned around in surprise. Lady Adney, you know some magic. Do you have the level of a mage apprentice? A little higher than that, but really just a little. That's enough. Brando waved his hand. He saw that Adney was about to speak again and interrupted her. Double it. What? Adney's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. The reward, Brando replied with the face of a tycoon. I'll double the one we agreed on before. How about it? Of course, no problem. Wait, you're not lying to me, are you, Mr. Brando? A crystal drew an arc in the air and fell into her hand. This is the deposit. Brando said to her. Adney looked at the crystal and had the same reaction as Exane. She sucked in a breath of cold air. A flame-patterned crystal. This crystal alone was enough to cover half of their reward, and it was only a deposit. The vice-captain immediately saw the extent of Brando's wealth and couldn't help but blurt out. By the name of Martha, my lord, do you still need retainers? Brando froze for a moment, thinking that it would be great if these mercenaries could join him. A dozen or so elemental enlightenment experts would almost double his strength in Tonajol. Of course, he replied at once, I welcome a capable person like Miss Adney at any time. Adney's eyes were almost shining. Good. When this is over, I'll definitely resign. Count, you can't go back on your words. Resign. Aren't you mercenaries? Brando couldn't help but laugh when he saw the knight lowering their heads and covering their faces. Even though he knew that these guys weren't mercenaries, he couldn't help but feel amused. If this world was filled with mercenaries of this level, the world would have been in chaos long ago. She did not expect Brendel to question her on this point. She stuttered to the point that she could not even speak properly. Count Brendel, the wind was too strong just now. Did you hear wrongly? Quill looked up at the sky and sighed. However, Brando didn't hold on to this matter. Since he already knew that these people's identities might not be that simple, he only needed to know if they had malicious intentions. But judging from the current situation, it didn't seem likely. At the very least, if assassins or spies were so incompetent, then there was probably no such thing as a successful assassination or leak of secrets in this world. Moreover, he still had other things to do. What he needed to do was to set up some simple wind magic circles. The speed of these ships clearly wasn't enough. Even if he added a few oars, it wouldn't help. After all, even if his oarsmen were heroes from the Argo that went to the sacred forest to retrieve the Golden Fleece, they wouldn't be able to double the speed of the ships. Moreover, these ships weren't sailing ships. If this was his original world, he might be helpless. But this was Woned, a world of magic. In fact, most sailing ships in this world were built with many magical materials, such as the lighter rudder that was enchanted with water magic and the wind sails that were enchanted with wind magic. This made them much faster than sailing ships in the real world. However, Brando knew that with the support of magic, they could be even faster. However, first of all, this required a one-time magic storage item. Secondly, it also required the continuous support of a magician. Generally speaking, only floating battleships had this kind of treatment. He had never heard of sailing ships burning money like this. After all, most sailing ships in this world were merchant ships, and merchants always had to consider the cost. Brando didn't have a magician, but he knew that Madara had a lich. Even without the support of a bone staff, an intermediate lich was still at the level of an apprentice magician. As for the magic storage item, Brando planned to make it himself. Don't forget that he still had an alchemy level. Although he hadn't used it for a long time and it was almost rusty, and the ship didn't have an alchemy lab or any suitable materials, he didn't need these things. He had the blood sacrifice alchemy. Secondly, he had money. The second point was especially important. Brando planned to use magic crystals to make a magic storage array. He planned to use magic to directly release energy to simulate magic. This was the only way to simply and crudely bypass all the necessary materials. However, the price was naturally to burn money. Insersta had 5 mid-level liches under his command. If 2 of them were to maintain a magic circle, he would have to consider abandoning one of the ships. However, if that was the case, he would have to concentrate everyone on the remaining 2 ships, which would further slow down the ship's speed. Right now, they were in a race against time. Every second the ship slowed down meant more danger. This was obviously not the result he wanted. Delphian was now a necromancer. Unfortunately, after she was sealed into a card by Brando, she wasn't summoned by the twin death moons. Therefore, her current power was not based on the Mephistopheles and Enrich. She was just a normal person like herself, so her ability was temporarily out of the question. Fortunately, Adeline also knew magic, so the problem was solved. However, if he were to make 3 magic arrays, Brando estimated that he would need to use at least half of the magic crystals he had on him. This number was shocking enough. After all, he had brought a lot of magic crystals from Tonajol. Later on, he replenished some from the fleet at Fathom Harbor. When he was in the elemental frontier, Miss Tata and the Termosian had also given him some. The latter part of the magic crystals was especially high quality. It could be said that half of the magic crystals he had on him was more than enough to build a frigate, let alone speed up the sailing ship. This was also the reason why merchants never used this method to speed up their sailing ships. Therefore, when Brando finished drawing the blood sacrifice array on the deck and then covered it with a layer of magic crystals, almost everyone on the ship was stunned. Most of them were people of status. Insursta was a noble in Madara, and the Knights of Ra's Wings were also of noble birth in Lubeck. Not to mention Huang Hua and Mr. Liu, although Fang Qi wasn't a noble in the Nine Phoenix, his birth was only higher than that. It wasn't that they hadn't seen alchemy before, but they had never seen such a rich alchemy. This wasn't alchemy at all. It was simply a joke with the magic crystals. Fang Qi stood at the side with his arms crossed. He was full of disdain for Brando's alchemy level. Apart from the somewhat strange blood sacrifice method, in his opinion, this country bumpkin from the west was indeed worthy of his identity as a country bumpkin. Few people knew that he, the genius of the Ghost Chariot clan, was also quite a genius in alchemy. Although he wasn't far superior to Tamar, he, who had received systematic learning and education in alchemy, was at least not inferior to the alchemy masters that Brando knew. Not to mention, the alchemy of the East and the West both had their advantages. At least at this moment, Brando's alchemy was basically not worth mentioning in his eyes. However, after a while, he felt a little toothache. To be exact, he felt a little heartache for those magic crystals. It wasn't that the Ghost Chariot clan didn't have that much wealth, but that was the wealth of the entire organization. At least, he didn't have that much money to squander. As for Miss Adney, she was tightly clinging to Quill's sleeve, almost unable to breathe. If it weren't for the Elven Ranger supporting her, she would have collapsed to the ground. Her eyes were filled with the radiance of magic crystals, sparkling brightly, and her mouth kept chanting as if she had been possessed. "Oh my God, Martha above, Lord R.A., I'm not dreaming, am I? You also know alchemy." Insursta looked at Brando with a little surprise, but he soon exclaimed in a fuss, "This is blood sacrifice alchemy. Isn't this taboo under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire? Oh my God, how can you do this? Hurry up and put away those magic crystals. If you don't lack money, just give them to me." But Brando didn't care about his clamor here. As soon as the magic circle was formed, he directly flipped Odorfice's blade and gently cut his thumb. But this time, it didn't cut. Brendel almost scared himself out of his wits. He quickly increased his strength and cut a second time. There was a sharp pain, and this time he barely managed to cut a thin wound. Then he saw a drop of golden blood flowing out from it. Brando couldn't help but be stunned. He knew how sharp the holy sword Odorfice was. In the whole, the amber sword, there was probably no sword with a higher attack power than these holy swords. He was very careful before, afraid that he would cut off his finger. That would be too funny, but he never dreamed that he would have to use electricity to cut a hole in his body with Odorfice. And what's with the color of the blood? He dared to swear that when he was in the elemental barrier, his body didn't have such changes. This was either some kind of mutation when he passed through the spatial crack of the magic storm, or the powerful life force of the nature orb during the explosion of Rosaline's body brought about changes to his body. In his heart, he was more inclined to the latter. And just as Brando was stunned, the others were also stunned, but they didn't notice the color of the blood flowing out of Brando's body. They were shocked by the sudden flames of all the magic crystals on the magic circle. Adeline even let out a sigh mixed with many complicated feelings. This sigh was so melancholic that it made people who heard it feel disheartened, as if they were about to jump into the sea and commit suicide. Chapter 1277. The grey cliff stood tall in the fog. Such a scene was often seen in the fjords around the Sopelach. They were like silent giants standing by the sea, and the ships passing under their feet were frighteningly small. The wind was somewhat cold. It was not the cold of autumn in Abes, but the temperature was bone-chilling. Because this was the south of the Great Glacier, when people talked about the Great Glacier, their faces would always change. The wind howled at the top of the canyon, making a sound like a ruler scraping through a rag. Dark clouds covered the fjords, making people feel as if the sky would collapse at any time. Logically speaking, under such bad weather, the fog should have been blown away. But the wind poured into the fjords, and the fog from the outside continued to pour in. Instead, the fog in the straits churned, as if it would never stop. The fleet set off from Gussel, and took 3 to 4 hours to reach the Sopelach. Because the fog came from the north, they had to take refuge in the fjords in advance. The terrain in the Sopelach fjords was complicated. After traveling for half an hour through the winding straits, they could no longer distinguish between front and back. As for the pirates' hiding place, it was even more remote. Brando was not in a hurry. He used the lines of law to scan the surrounding fjords, carefully searching for the clues he wanted. Soon, he found an unusual place. After a quarter of an hour, the fleet appeared there. It was a bay canyon with its own world in its belly. The entrance was at a 90-degree angle, blocking the wind from the outside, making this wide body of water appear somewhat tranquil. There was some thin mist floating on the surface of the water like a veil. In the depths of the canyon, there was a huge cave entrance. The cave entrance was connected to the surface of the sea, allowing ships to navigate. In addition, it was located in the depths of the fjords, very hidden, and very suitable for pirates to hide. If he did not spread out his extreme planes, ordinary people would not be able to find it. When the 3 ships slowly sailed into the inner canyon, passing through the mist, they saw the huge cave entrance hanging alone on the cliff. Everyone could not help but look at the Count of Erewhon with respect and admiration. The journey had been fraught with danger, but Brendel had led them out of Gussel's encirclement, and then he had taken out a legendary amount of wealth and generously burned it to the ground, allowing the fleet to sail on the wind and arrive at Sopelach before dawn. Then he decisively ordered the fleet to hide in the fjords in advance, and with his own strength, he broke through the heavy fog and came to this place. Seeing the pirates' hiding place in front of them, even if they were on the opposing side, Insursta and Tarkus could not help but cheer for each other. It's not like Madara can't accept a noble from another country. Count, if you're willing to bow down to His Majesty, Aween will remain the same. Enchanting did not know how many times he had said this in Brando's ear. Brando stood at the bow of the ship, looked back at him with a slight smile, and shook his head. Can you promise this? And I have no intention of becoming the king of Erewhon. I will have a good talk with your majesty, but it's hard to say who will be in charge. Enchanting sighed. When these two met, it would be hard to predict what would happen. But even if Madara had another outstanding dark noble, it would be good. Subconsciously, he no longer regarded Brando as someone on the same level as himself, but compared him to the existence with the Mercury Staff. But he was still not optimistic about Brando's chances. He did not have the slightest doubt about the rise of the Kingdom of the Dead Moon, and in another time and space, it was indeed the same. The three ships slowly sailed into the cave, and the surrounding lights suddenly dimmed. Adney's Knight's men lit torches, and under the flickering light, they found that the inside of the cave was extremely wide. A wide and deep waterway went straight into the depths of the darkness, surrounded by smooth limestone walls. The cave was 30 to 50 feet high, and countless stalactites hung overhead. Brando and Tarkus originally planned to sail in at the risk of running the ship aground, but they did not expect the waterway to be so good. It had a very deep draft, and looked like a natural harbor. Although the throughput may be a little small, it was extremely rare as an anchorage. God knows how the pirates found this place. The light of the torches slowly moved forward with the ship, illuminating the surrounding dark cave walls. The limestone walls of the cave were mixed with some kind of metal, which refracted a yellow light. But the deep waterway had an end. Soon, they saw a small bay that could anchor one or two ships. At the other end of the bay, there seemed to be a simple dock. A crooked wooden trestle was built into the deep water and connected to the shore. At this moment, there were no ships in the dock, and no pirates. This made the knight, who had been ready to fight with weapons in hand, suddenly feel relieved. But they were a little unwilling. They had been chased all the way from Gussel like a stray dog, and the enemy was nowhere to be seen. To these masters of their respective fields who had the dignity of being masters, this was obviously very frustrating. Masters of elemental enlightenment were considered masters in every aspect, and to have such a group of people gather together as mercenaries was probably something only Lady Adney could think of. Compared to that, they would rather fight to their heart's content. Even if they lost. In the end, they did not even touch the pirates. The pirates did not anchor their ships in the port, which meant that they did not stay here. This was not surprising. After all, this was just a hideout, not their nest. Just like the temporary anchorages often used by smugglers, they would occasionally stay in those places when storms came, but they would not stay there permanently. Everyone felt lost, but in fact, it was just a psychological effect. After all, if they could avoid fighting, no one would be willing to do it except for fanatical warmongers. The two ships entered the port one after the other. The Ghost Chariot clan's ship had been left outside, because no matter how big the cave was, it could not accommodate such a large armed merchant ship. A layer of mist hung in the cave, just like the inner gorge outside, but it was much better than outside the fjord. The fleet in the mist had almost covered the entire Taoiseach Strait. Brando had never seen so many lost names in this life and his previous life, let alone others. After the ship was parked, everyone disembarked one by one. Then Tarkus ordered the skeleton soldiers on the ship to drill through the ship and let them sink here to prevent them from being used by outsiders. The first batch of skeleton soldiers who landed by boat had already explored the passage at the other end of the cave, so these ships were naturally not needed. Tarkus and Brando did not expect to wait until the mist outside dissipated before continuing to sail out to sea, not to mention that it was not necessarily safe dozens of miles offshore. They had to reach the real inland area to completely avoid the march of the lost names. This was also the reason why they did not directly force their way ashore from other places. After landing, they had to open up a path along the wilderness. Who knew when they would run into the marching route of the lost names? Since this was the pirates' landing point, there must be a safe land route behind it. Otherwise, this place would at most be a safe haven, not a temporary lair. As for whether sinking the ship would cause any trouble for the people behind it, Brando had never considered this issue. Why should he be so considerate for the pirates? As for Tarkus, he was even more disdainful to consider this. Even if the undead might reactivate this port in the future, they would have the means to salvage the sunken ship. As for the pirates, who cared about this? After everyone got off the ship, the cave seemed a little cramped. After all, in addition to Brando, Delphian, and Phoenix Hua, there were 2 squadrons of skeleton soldiers and a group of low-level liches on the 2 armed smuggling ships from Madara. They were usually locked in the bottom cabin as ballast in Madara style. They would only be released when there was a battle or when they needed to land. In addition to the skeleton soldiers, there were also the sailors on the Ghost Chariot's armed merchant ship. There were also more than 10 people. Including the 2 elders and their servants, as well as Fong Chi's subordinates and servants, there were about 20 to 30 people. Adney and her night men were another group. For a time, there were more than 100 people in the pirates' hiding place. It was obviously impossible for this small place to not look cramped. Tarkus divided 1.5 squadrons of skeleton soldiers, the other half was left in Gus' cell, into 2 groups. One group continued to act as cannon fodder in front, and 3 liches were in charge of commanding them. The other group, which was larger in number, was at the back. It was not to guard against anything, but mainly to serve as a warning. If they encountered the lost names later, at least they could detect them in advance. They were still cannon fodder in essence. The sailors of the Phantom Chariot were naturally captives at this time, but no one cared about the ordinary sailors. The servants of the 2 elders of the Phantom Chariot were quite strong, so they were watched over by Adney's knight. Of course, Brando also paid for this. The female knight was very satisfied with Brando's generous employer. Only the 2 elders of the Phantom Chariot were a little troublesome for Brando and Tarkus. After all, they were Supreme Class Masters, although only half a step into the Supreme Class. Even if Deputy Marshal Brando was monitoring them, there would be problems if he was not careful. The 2 had obviously suffered a lot these days. They had been locked in the bottom cabin with the skeletons and liches, and the food they ate was worse than pig and dog meat. It was not that Tarkus deliberately slighted them, but that was all the sailors could eat at sea. The undead could not specially prepare a cook for the 2 captives. That was the treatment that only Brando and Delphian had. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.